Hey there, and welcome back. Settle yourself down now, however you happen to be lying tonight, and let the day loosen and fall away from you, the way a heavy cloak slips from the shoulders at the end of a long road. This is not one of the still evenings, the quiet hall, and the single fire, and the snow heaped at the door. Tonight we are going down to the sea, and out across it, to be one among a great host of men leaving everything they have ever known and crossing the cold grey water to a rich green country they have come to take for their own. It is for anyone who has ever wondered what it was to be one of them. Not a name set down by a frightened monk in a chronicle, but a young man at the oar with the salt on his lips and the home shore sinking behind him. I would like to take you across with them tonight, more than 1,000 years ago, on a single crossing from the home beach to the foreign shingle, and to stand beside you through the long days of open water until the keel grinds at last onto the sand of a realm that will never be the same again. So let this century slip off you, and come back with me to a grey morning on a northern beach where the ships are drawn up on the shingle and the tide is making and the whole host is gathering to sail. And somewhere out there, far beyond the edge of the world, you can see, past days of empty water and a night or two of cold stars, there lies a low green coast that does not yet know you are coming, and that will, before this 1 year has turned, swallow your old life whole and remake you into something you cannot yet imagine, though tonight, leaning on your oar, you think only of the sea. Before we push off from that beach together, let me say the one small thing I always say, and it belongs to this night more than most. Every soul in this fleet is leaving a known shore for an unknown one, setting out across a wide, dark water toward a place they have only heard of, and trusting the sea and one another to carry them there. So it feels right on a night like this to think of you out there too, wherever you are lying and listening from, in whatever country, at whatever hour the dark has reached you. If these journeys into other times are something you would like to keep finding, you are welcome to subscribe, so that more of them can make their way to you on the nights you need them, and it costs you nothing at all. I read the notes that people leave, the places they write from, and the late hours these stories reach them at, and I think of all of you as a kind of scattered fleet of your own, each setting out alone into the same dark toward morning. You are welcome, if you like, to tell me where you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are. That is all I will ask of you. Now let us go down to the ships. Picture this: a long shore of grey shingle under a low grey sky, somewhere on the cold northern edge of the world, in the raw half-light of a morning more than 1,000 years ago. The tide is making, sliding up the stones with a long hiss and draw, and the air is full of the smell of salt and weed and tar and wood smoke, the smell of the sea and of the fires of the camp behind the dunes. And all along the shore, drawn up on the shingle with their high-carved prows pointing out to the water, lie the ships, more of them than you have ever seen, gathered in one place, long and lean and dark, rocking a little as the tide comes in under their hulls. Men move among them in the grey light, hundreds of them, carrying gear down to the boats, calling low to one another, their breath smoking in the cold, and over it all hangs the particular hush of a morning when something enormous is about to begin, the quiet of a great many people who all know that by tonight the home shore will be gone from sight behind them. Let us look first at the men themselves, at who they are and why they have come down to this beach, for they are not quite what the frightened chronicles would have you believe. They are not demons risen from the sea, nor a single savage horde of one mind. They are men, ordinary enough to look at, of every age, from the smooth-faced boy on his first crossing to the grey-bearded veteran of a dozen. And they have come to this shore for reasons as ordinary and as human as any that have ever moved a person to leave home. Some are second and third sons, who will inherit no land at home, for the farm goes whole to the eldest, and who see in this voyage the one chance they will ever have to win land and standing of their own. Some are men with a name to make, restless and proud, hungry for the wealth and the fame that a successful venture overseas could bring. Some are following a lord they have sworn to, bound to him by oath and by the gifts he has given them, and where he goes, they go. And some, in truth, simply have nowhere better to be. Outlaws and wanderers and men the homeland has no more use for, who have thrown in their lot with the host, because the host will take them. What binds them is not blood, for they come from many districts and many families, but the shared venture itself, the great gamble they have all chosen to make. For this is no quick raid, no summer's outing to snatch the silver from a coastal church and be home before the harvest. This is something the like of which has not been tried before. A whole army gathered to cross the sea, and not merely to rob the rich green land beyond it, but to break it, to beat down its kings, and take its ground and stay. The men on this beach know that. They have heard the talk through the long winter, the plans laid by the leaders, the great chieftains whose names run through the camp. Hard and famous men who have promised that this time they will not come back with a few sacks of plunder, but will carve out kingdoms. It is an enormous thing to have staked your life on, and every man here feels the weight of it under the ordinary business of loading the boats, the knowledge that he is sailing not for a season, but, if the venture holds, for good. And so there is, beneath the brisk work of the morning, a current of feeling that no one speaks aloud. These men are leaving. Behind the dunes are the last fires of their home shores, and beyond them, the farms and the families and the whole known world they were born into, and many of them are looking their last on all of it. A man does not say so. He checks his gear, he jokes with his oar mate, he carries his sea chest down to the boat. But he knows, and the man beside him knows, that the shore they are standing on is the edge of everything familiar, and that what lies beyond the grey water is unknown and dangerous, and theirs to win or to die in. Hold that, as you stand among them in the cold dawn, the brave, hard purpose, and the unspoken ache of leaving both at once. For that doubleness is the truest thing about this morning, and it goes with these men all the way across the sea. And look about you, as you stand on the shingle, at the men you will be crossing with, for they are a more varied gathering than you might suppose. Not one people, but many, drawn together into this one host. The folk we lump together under a single name were never a single nation, but a scatter of peoples spread along the cold coasts and islands of the north, divided into countless small kingdoms and districts and led by countless chieftains, speaking kindred tongues but owing no common loyalty, and the host on this beach has drawn its men from across that whole scattered world. There are men here from the long peninsulas of the far north, and men from the flat windy lands to the south of them, and men from the islands, and men whose families had already settled and roved in other lands across the sea before this venture ever called them. They have come together not because they are one people, but because the venture has gathered them, each warband following its own lord, each lord drawn in by the promise of what so great a host might win. You can hear it if you listen, in the talk along the beach, the different turns of speech, the men from one district sounding strange to the ears of another, though all can understand one another well enough. You can see it in the gear, the slightly different fashions of dress and ornament that mark a man's homeland to those who know how to read them. And you can feel it in the loose, proud, quarrelsome nature of the host itself, which is no disciplined single army under one undisputed king, but a great confederation of warbands, held together by the shared venture and by the authority of its famous leaders, and liable, if the venture should sour or the leaders fall out, to fracture again into its parts. It is a thing worth understanding about this host, that its unity is a thing of choice and circumstance rather than of blood. A great gathering of free and dangerous men who have agreed for now to pull together toward a common prize. And yet for all their differences, they share a world, these men, a common way of seeing and living that binds them deeper than any kingdom could. They share the same gods, the same code of honor and loyalty, the same love of the sea and the ship and the bold venture, the same hard view of a hard world. They share the consummate craft of seafaring that has carried their kind to the edges of the known earth. And they share, above all, the thing that has brought them to this beach, the hunger for more than their crowded home countries could ever give them, the willingness to stake everything on a crossing into the unknown. That shared hunger and that shared world make them, for all their scattered origins, a single host in the only way that matters, a host of men bound by a common daring. And it is among them, one of them now, that you will cross the sea. Now let us go down to the boats and look closely at the ships that will carry you over, for they are wonders in their own right. Come down the shingle, then, to where one of the long ships lies waiting, and look at her closely, for she is the finest thing these people make, and the whole venture rests upon her. She is long and slender and low, far longer than you would think a boat could be, and still hold together, built for speed and for the open sea both. Her timbers curving up at either end into the high-prowed prow and stern, that give these vessels their look of a living thing, a serpent or a swan, riding the water. Her hull is built of overlapping planks of split oak, each riveted to the one below, and the seams packed tight against the sea. And she is so cunningly made that she does not sit stiff in the water like a heavy southern ship, but flexes and gives with the waves, riding them rather than fighting them, alive under your feet. Down her centre runs the single mast, lowered now for the launch, with the heavy woolen sail furled along it, and out from her sides reach the oars, a long row of them down each flank. For she is driven by sail when the wind serves, and by the backs of her men when it does not. There is something about these ships that the bare description misses, which is that the men who built and sailed them did not think of them as mere objects of wood and iron, but very nearly as living beings, and treated them so. A ship was named, and the name was a proud one, often a name of power, or of the sea, or of a beast, and she was spoken of as a living thing, given her due, her moods read and respected. At her prow she might carry a carved head, a dragon or a serpent reared up snarling at the sea, a thing meant to strike fear into enemies and to ward off the unseen powers of the deep. So that the ship came on like a living monster breasting the waves. The men knew her ways as they knew the ways of a horse or a hound, knew how she rode a sea, how she answered the steering oar, where she was stiff and where she was tender, and they trusted her with their lives as a rider trusts a good horse across dangerous ground. To board your ship for a crossing was to give yourself over to her keeping, and a man felt for his ship something close to love. The deep regard of one who knows that this slender thing of oak is all that stands between him and the cold deep that would swallow him without a trace. She is not large within, for all her length. There is no deck to walk, no cabin to shelter in, only the open hull with the rowing benches set across it and the men's sea chests doubling as the seats they row from. Down the middle, between the benches, is stowed everything the venture needs, lashed down under hides against the spray, the weapons and the shields and the tools, the food and the water, the gear of war and the gear of settlement both. For these men are carrying with them everything they will need to fight a region and then to live in it. It is astonishing, when you understand it, how much is asked of so slight a vessel to carry 30 or 40 fighting men and all their gear across days of open ocean, and to do it again and again, ship after ship, until a whole army has been ferried over. And yet these ships did exactly that, year upon year, the length and breadth of the known world. And there is a reason the people who built them ranged so far, for in these long, lean hulls they had the finest sea boats of the age, and the sea roads of half the world lay open to them because of it. Watch the loading now, for it is the work of the morning, and it is done with the unhurried care of men who know the sea. The heavy gear goes down into the bottom of the hull, first low and central, so that the ship will swim true and not roll, the casks of water and the sacks of food and the war gear stowed and lashed where it will not shift. The men bring their own sea chests down and stow them at the benches, for a man's chest holds all he owns for the voyage and serves him as his seat at the oar. The shields are ranged along the ship's sides, overlapping, both to stow them out of the way and to give a little shelter from the spray. And last of all, the men themselves climb aboard, wading out through the cold shallows and swinging up over the side, finding their places along the benches, settling their gear about their feet, until the ship that lay empty on the shingle is full of life and low in the water with the weight of all she carries. She is ready now. The tide is high, and along the shore the other ships are readying too, the whole fleet coming alive at once, and the moment that every man has known was coming is almost here. Let us take our own place at an oar and feel the ship come off the realm. There is a moment in the launching of a ship from a beach that you never forget, and it is coming now. The men who are not yet aboard set their shoulders to the hull and run her down the shingle, the keel grinding and then sliding on the wet stones, faster, until the sea takes her weight and she lifts and floats and is suddenly no longer a thing of the realm, but a thing of the water, light and quick and free. The last men swing aboard, dripping, and take up their oars, and at a low call the blades go out and dip together and pull, and the ship gathers way and noses out through the small surf into the open water of the bay, and the home shore begins to fall away behind you. Slowly at first, the beach and the dunes and the thin smoke of the last fires sliding back, growing smaller and then faster as the ship finds her stride and the ground draws off astern, lower and dimmer, until it is only a grey line on the water behind you. And then hardly even that. Feel what it is to watch your country sink into the sea behind you. The men row steadily, facing astern as rowers do, and so they are looking back the whole time at the region they are leaving, watching it go, and there is no talk now, or little. Only the creak and dip of the oars and the wash of the water along the hull and the cry of the last shorebirds following the fleet out. Every man at the oar is watching the same grey line dwindle, the last of the home shores, and every man knows that he may never see it again. That the next land his eyes will rest on is the foreign coast they are sailing to take, and that between here and there lies nothing but the wide cold sea. It is a hush full of feeling, that long watching of the shore going down, and it binds the men together in it, all of them carried out on the same tide toward the same unknown, all of them leaving the same world behind. And then the kingdom is gone. There comes a moment when the last grey smudge of it slips under the rim of the sea, and there is nothing behind you any longer but water. Water on every side to the edge of sight. The ship, a small thing of wood, and men afloat in the middle of an emptiness, greater than anything you have known. The other ships of the fleet are around you, near and far, their sails going up now as they clear the territory and catch the wind. Dark hulls and pale sails scattered across the grey water, and that is a comfort. The company of the fleet, the knowledge that you are not alone out here. But the world has changed all the same. The land is behind you and gone. The venture has truly begun, and there is no turning back. Now only the long crossing ahead and the foreign shore at the end of it. Settle to your oar, then, or rest, while the sail does the work, and let us feel what it was to live aboard one of these ships, out on the open sea, for the days of the crossing that lie ahead. The first hours of true open water are, for the body, a hard schooling, for a man must learn the sea before he can be easy on it, and the learning is not gentle. The motion of the ship out here is nothing like the steady glide of the sheltered bay. She rises and falls on the long swell, she rolls from side to side, she pitches and corkscrews and works beneath you in a ceaseless, complicated, sickening dance. And a body new to it, or grown soft over a winter ashore, rebels. The sickness comes on slowly at first, a queasiness, a cold sweat, a swimming of the head and then in earnest, and a man hangs over the side and gives up everything in him to the sea, again and again, until there is nothing left to give, and still his body heaves, wretched and weak, and wishing, in that hour, that he had never left the realm at all. It is a misery, the seasickness, and no respecter of courage, for the bravest fighting man can be laid low by it, as surely as the greenest boy. And there is a rough mercy in the way the old hands bear with the suffering of the new, for they have all been through it themselves. They know it passes. They know that the body, given a day or two, learns the sea, finds the new rhythm, makes its peace with the endless motion, and that the man who is green and wretched at the start of a voyage will be eating his ration and pulling his oar with the rest of them before the crossing is half done. So they leave a sick man to his misery with a gruff word or two, and let the sea do its hard teaching. And in a day or two, sure enough, the worst of it lifts, and the man finds he can stand and eat and work, his body grown used at last to the living, moving deck beneath him. And there is a strange thing that happens once the body has learned the sea, which the old hands know and the new ones discover with wonder. The motion that was agony becomes in time almost a comfort. The great slow rise and fall of the ship on the swell, turning from a torment into a kind of rocking, deep and rhythmic and oddly soothing. So that a man who could not bear it at the start finds himself, by the middle of the crossing, lulled by the very thing that sickened him, able even to sleep to it, rocked in the cradle of the heaving sea. The body is a wonderful thing, and it learns. By the time the foreign shore comes up out of the haze, the men who staggered green aboard will be seamen, easy on the moving deck, their bodies tuned to the sea, and they will carry that hard-won ease with them for the rest of their roving lives. But that is days ahead yet. For now, settle into the rhythm of the open water and let us feel how the long crossing settles into its own strange shape. The crossing settles, after the first day, into a rhythm, and that rhythm becomes your whole world for as long as the sea road lasts. When the wind serves, the sail is set and the ship runs before it, heeling a little, the water hissing down her flanks, and there is nothing to do but tend the sail and the steering oar and let her carry you. And those are the good hours, the easy miles, the wind doing the work and the men resting along the benches. When the wind fails or sets against you, the sail comes down and the oars go out, and then it is the backs of the men that move the ship, stroke after stroke after stroke, the blades dipping together, the long pull, the lift, the swing forward, and again, until your shoulders burn and your hands blister and the horizon seems never to come any closer. The rhythm of the oars becomes a kind of trance after a while, the body working of itself, the mind drifting, the ship creeping over the immensity of the water, one stroke at a time. There is a strange smallness to it, this crossing of the open sea in an open boat, that the men feel keenly, though they would not put it into words. The ship that seems so sleek and fine on the beach is a tiny thing out here, a sliver of wood on the face of the deep, and the sea is everything, stretching away grey and heaving to the rim of the sky on every side, indifferent and enormous and old. The sky is huge above you, the water huge below, and you and your shipmates are a handful of warm lives strung out across all that cold emptiness, kept afloat by a skin of oak planks no thicker than your hand. It is a thing that could frighten a man if he let it, and so the men do not let it. They keep to the rhythm, they keep to the work, they keep their eyes on the next ship of the fleet rather than on the vastness all around. And they trust the steersman and the ship and the old skill of their people to carry them through as it has carried their fathers before them. For these men had no instruments to find their way, no charts of the sea, no needle pointing north, nothing of all the gear that later sailors would lean on. They crossed the open ocean by knowledge alone, by a craft handed down and held in the head, and it is one of the wonders of these people, how far they sailed with so little. The steersman reads the sea itself, the run and the colour of the swell, the direction of the long waves that the prevailing winds drive across the deep. He reads the sky, the place of the sun by day when it shows, the place of the stars by night when they are clear, holding his course by their slow turning. He reads the birds, knowing which fly far out to sea and which keep close to land, watching the way they go at dusk for a hint of where the shore lies. He reads the very creatures of the water, and the drift of weed, and the feel of the wind, all the thousand small signs that the sea offers up to a man who has spent his life learning to read them. It is not certain knowledge, and a crossing could go wrong, a fleet be scattered or driven far off its course by storm and fog, but it was knowledge enough, more often than not, to carry these ships clear across the open sea to a coast they could not see when they set out. And that is a marvel worth holding as you watch the steersman at his oar, his eyes on the water, finding the way to England in his head. It is worth holding too, because of where that knowledge lived, which was nowhere but in the minds of the men who held it. Passed from one to the next, by word and by doing, never written down. A steersman carried in his memory the whole lore of the sea roads his people sailed, the look of a coast from far out, the run of the currents and the set of the swells in different waters, the bird life and the weather signs of 100 passages, the sailing directions for getting from one place to another, all of it learned at the side of older men over a lifetime and held in the head alone. There were no schools for it and no books, only the long apprenticeship of the sea, the years of watching and doing and remembering until a man had the knowledge in him deep enough to stake other men's lives on. And when such a man died, a part of that knowledge died with him, unless he had passed it on, so that the whole great craft of the northern seafarer was a living thing carried in living minds, handed down the generations like a fire kept always burning, the priceless inheritance that let these people range farther over the open water than any folk had done before them. Life aboard, in the long hours and days of the crossing, is hard in a plain bodily way that the chronicles never trouble to mention. There is no shelter on the ship, no roof, no dry place, and you live out under the open sky for the whole of the voyage, in whatever the weather sends. The spray comes aboard in any sea, flung back off the bow, and the rain comes when it comes, and there is no escaping either, so that you are wet, more or less, the whole time. Your woolen clothes, heavy and clammy with salt and damp, never truly drying. The cold works into you, the deep chill of the open water that no fire can touch, for there is no fire aboard, and you warm yourself only by rowing and by huddling against your shipmates when you rest. The food is cold and plain, the dried fish and the hard bread, and the water, going stale in the casks, eaten where you sit. And the ship is cramped, every man crowded into his narrow place along the bench, no room to stretch or walk, living for days in a space hardly bigger than the bench he sits on, cheek by jowl with the same men, hour upon hour. And there is fear under it all, however a man hides it. The sea is dangerous, and every man aboard knows it, knows that a bad storm could swamp the ship or drive her under, that a man washed over the side in rough water is simply gone, that the deep beneath the thin planks is cold and patient and would take them all without a ripple. The men do not speak of it, for to speak of it would be to feed it, but it is there, in the wary glance at a darkening sky, in the tightening of the grip on the oar when the swell builds, in the low words of an old charm muttered against the sea's malice. They are brave men, hard men, but they are not fools, and they know how slender is the thread that holds them up, and the knowing rides with them the whole way over. To be aboard, then, is to live for days wet and cold and cramped and afraid, working your body to its limit, with the great indifferent sea all around and the foreign shore impossibly far ahead, and to do it anyway, because the venture has begun and there is no other way but through. And the fear was not idle, for the sea took its toll quietly and without warning, even when there was no storm. A man at the oar in a heavy swell, reaching too far or losing his footing as the ship rolled, could go over the side in an instant, gone before a hand could reach him, and in such a sea there was often nothing to be done. The ship could not easily turn, heavy and crowded as she was, and a man in that cold water, weighed down by his sodden woolens, weakened in moments by the chill that no man could long endure, was beyond saving almost before the cry went up. One moment he was there at his bench, a living man, your shipmate, and the next there was a gap where he had been, and a dwindling shape in the wake, and then nothing. Only the grey water closing over, as if he had never been. The sea did not pause, the ship sailed on, and the men at the oars pulled with their jaws set and their eyes forward, and did not speak of it. There were other ways the crossing killed, less sudden, but as sure. There was the cold itself, the deep chill of days and nights of wet and exposure that could weaken a man until a fever took him, or simply wear the life out of one, already sick or old. There was thirst, if the water casks ran foul or short on a long passage, and hunger if the voyage outran its stores. And there was the loss of whole ships, in the worst of the storms or the thickest of the fogs. A vessel and all her men swallowed by the sea and never seen again, so that a fleet that set out whole might come to land with its numbers. Quietly lessened, a ship here and a ship there, simply gone, their fate never known. The crossing was a danger every mile of the way, and not every man who pushed off from the home beach set foot on the foreign shore, and the men knew it, and went anyway. There was a hardness in how they bore it, the deaths at sea, that can seem cold to us, but was the only way to bear such a thing at all. A man lost overboard was mourned in the heart by those who had loved him, and his name might be remembered, and his deeds spoken of when the voyage was done. But there was no stopping for grief in the middle of the crossing, no turning back, no ceremony the sea would allow. The dead were given to the water, and the living rode on, and the venture went forward, because it had to. Because the only way to honour a man lost on such a crossing was to carry through the thing he had died attempting. Hold that too, the quiet toll of the sea road, the shipmates who did not arrive, for it is part of the true weight of the crossing, and the men who reached the foreign shore had many of them left friends behind them in the deep. Let us come now to the first night on the open water, for the nights at sea are a thing apart. The first night out is the one a man remembers, for it is then that the full strangeness of the crossing comes home to him. The light goes slowly from the grey sky, the sun, if it has shone, sinking into the water far astern, and the sea darkens from grey to slate to black. And the world shrinks down to the ship, and the few lengths of heaving water you can still make out around her. The other ships of the fleet become first dark shapes, and then only the dim glow of a lantern hung at a masthead here and there. Scattered points of light riding the dark swell, each one a shipful of men like your own, keeping company across the night. And then even those grow faint, and there is only the dark, the immense black of the open sea at night, the black water and the black sky meeting at no visible line, and the ship, a small creaking world of her own, afloat in the middle of it. You cannot sleep much that night, or not well. There is no place to lie but where you sit, curled against your sea chest or against your neighbour, wrapped in your wet cloak, the cold seeping up through the planks beneath you, and the spray flicking over you whenever the bow takes a wave. The ship is never still, rising and falling on the long swell, rolling and working, the timbers creaking and groaning all around you in the blackness, the water rushing and slapping along the hull, a hand's breadth from your ear. And above you, when the clouds break, are the stars, more of them, and brighter than you ever see them over the region, wheeling slow and cold across the black sky. The same stars the steersman is holding his course by. turning over the masthead as the ship creeps on beneath them. There is something in that, lying wet and cold and sleepless in the bottom of a ship on the open sea, with the dark water all around and the wheeling stars above, that strips a man down to almost nothing. To a small warm spark of life adrift in a vast and freezing blackness, and it is a feeling he carries the rest of his days. Rest as you can then, through that first long night, and let the ship carry you on toward the dawn and the days of water still ahead, for the crossing is not over, and the sea has more to show you yet. For the sea is not only terror and hardship, and it would be wrong to cross it with you and show you only its cruelty, when it has wonders too that a man never forgets. There are the seabirds that follow a ship far out from any land, wheeling and gliding on the wind in the ship's wake, riding the air without a wing beat. The great white birds that seem to belong to the open water as much as to any shore, and the men watch them and read them, for a bird's flight at evening can hint at where the realm lies. There are the creatures of the deep that rise sometimes alongside, the dolphins that come to play about the bow, racing and leaping and crossing beneath the keel, a marvel that lifts the men's hearts and is taken, often, for a good omen, a sign of the sea's favour. And now and then there is the greatest sight of all, the slow dark back of a whale breaking the surface far off, or near, the vast gentle bulk of it rising and blowing and sinking again, a living mountain in the water, beside which the ship is a small frail thing indeed, and the men fall silent to watch it pass. And there is the beauty of the open water itself, in its kinder moods which can take a man's breath. There are dawns at sea when the sun climbs clean out of the water on a clear morning and lays a road of fire across the swell straight to the ship. And the grey sea turns for a while to gold and rose before it settles into the blue-grey of the day. There are evenings when the sun goes down the same way, sinking into the rim of the water in a blaze of colour, and the sea darkens slowly beneath the first stars. And there are the nights on the open water, far from any land, when the sky is clear and there is no light anywhere in the world but the stars, and they blaze down in their thousands. More than a man ever sees over the smoky fires of the ground, the whole great wheel of them turning slow above the masthead, and the sea itself sometimes answering them, the water breaking at the bow in a cold, pale fire of its own, glowing green-white where the ship disturbs it, so that she seems to sail through a sea of dim light under a sky of bright. These are the things that keep a man at the oar through all the hardship, the wonders the sea shows to those who venture out upon it, the beauty and the strangeness of the open water that the region bound never see. For all its cruelty, the sea is the great road of these people, the path of their daring and their fame, and they love it even as they fear it, the way a man loves a hard and dangerous country that is none the less his own. Hold that too as you cross. The wonder woven through the hardship, the dolphins at the bow and the fire in the water and the blaze of stars over the empty sea. For it is as true a part of the crossing as the cold and the fear, and it is what the men would remember in their old age by the fire, when they spoke of the days when they sailed the open water in their youth. The dawn of the second day comes slowly, a paling of the eastern sky, the black sea greying again into the heaving expanse of the day before, and you wake stiff and salt-crusted and aching to find the world unchanged, water on every side. The fleet scattered around you, the foreign shore still nowhere in sight. And this is how the middle days of the crossing pass, one much like another, a dull grinding sameness that wears on a man almost worse than the danger. The sun crosses the sky, when it shows at all, and sinks again. The wind rises and the sail goes up, or it falls and the oars come out. You eat your cold ration, you take your turn at the oar, you doze when you can, you watch the water, and the shore does not come. There is a longing that builds in a man on the long crossing, a deep bodily hunger for the sight of land, for solid ground under his feet. for warmth and a fire and an end to the wet and the cold and the endless heaving water, and it grows day by day until it is almost more than the fear, the simple, desperate wish for the sea to be over. And there is another longing too, deeper and quieter, that comes on a man in the empty middle of the crossing, which is the longing for what he has left behind. Out here, with nothing to do through the long hours but pull at the oar and watch the water, a man's mind drifts back, of itself, to the home he may never see again, and the memories come unbidden and sharp. He thinks of the farm where he was born, the look of the hills behind it, the smell of the byre and the hearth smoke, the faces of the family gathered in the firelight on a winter's night. He thinks of those he has left, a mother, a father, grown old, a brother, perhaps a girl he might have married, had there been land enough to marry on the people of his life, dwindling now behind him with the home shore, beyond the reach of the sea. He thinks of small things, a path he walked, a tree he climbed as a boy, the taste of a particular ale, the sound of his own tongue spoken by familiar voices, all the thousand small threads of a life, pulling at him across the widening water. It is a hard ache, that homesickness on the open sea, and a man must master it, or it will unman him, for there is no going back and no use in the longing. Only the crossing ahead and the new life he has staked everything to reach. So he does what men have always done with such an ache. He pushes it down. He turns his mind forward to the kingdom they are going to, the wealth and the ground he means to win, the new future that will more than repay all he has given up. He leans into the talk and the work and the rough company of his shipmates, who are leaving as much behind as he is, and who understand, without a word said, exactly what is in his heart, because the same thing is in theirs. The fellowship of the ship is partly that, a company of men, all carrying the same secret grief, and all helping one another to bear it, by not speaking of it, by looking forward together rather than back. And yet the longing does its quiet work all the same, for it is part of what binds these men so hard to the venture and to one another. A man who has given up everything, who has cut himself off from home and kin, and the whole world of his birth, and staked it all on this crossing, has nothing now but the venture and the men he shares it with, and so he holds to both with a fierce and desperate loyalty, for they are all he has left. The home shore is gone. The new ground is not yet won, and in between, on the empty heaving water, there is only the ship and the fellowship, and the shared longing for the life left behind and the life still to come, carrying the men forward through the grinding middle days toward whatever waits at the far edge of the sea. The men keep their spirits up as they can, for a sullen ship is a dangerous one. There is talk, in the easy hours, low and rambling, of home and of what waits ahead, of the territory they are going to and the wealth they mean to win, of past voyages and old fights and the deeds of famous men. There is the working of small tasks, the mending of gear, the sharpening of a blade, the splicing of a rope, the hands kept busy. Sometimes a man will sing low, an old song of the sea or the homeland, and others take it up. And the singing goes out thin over the water and is swallowed by the vastness. And there is the steady presence of the leaders, the hard, famous men, whose venture this is, moving among the ships when the fleet draws close, calling across the water, their confidence, a thing the men lean on. For if the chieftains are sure, then perhaps a man may let himself be sure too. So the middle days pass, in longing and tedium and quiet endurance, the ship creeping on across the immensity. There are other moods to the open sea than the heave and the labour, and one of the strangest is its stillness, for sometimes the wind dies away to nothing, and the ship is becalmed, and that is an eerie thing in its own way. The sail hangs slack and useless from the mast. The sea goes flat and oily and smooth, heaving only in a long, slow swell, with no wind to ruffle it. A vast sheet of dull pewter, stretching away on every side under a windless sky. and the ship sits motionless upon it, or nearly so, going nowhere, the men's only choice to row or to wait. And the silence presses in, the deep, enormous silence of the open sea, with no wind in it, broken only by the lap of the swell against the hull and the creak of the slack rigging. It can unsettle a man more than a gale. That stillness, the sense of being stranded and tiny in the middle of a flat grey eternity of water, the wind that is the ship's life simply gone, and nothing to do but wait for it to return. And there is the fog, which is worse, for the fog blinds you. It comes rolling in off the cold water, a thick grey blankness that swallows the ship and shrinks the world to a few lengths of dim water all around. And worst of all, it swallows the fleet, so that the other ships, the company that is the men's one comfort out here, vanish into the murk and are gone. To be fog-bound at sea is to be truly alone. Your ship, a small blind thing creeping through a grey nothing, no horizon, no sun, no stars, no way to know your course or your company. The calls of the other ships coming muffled and directionless out of the murk, or not coming at all. A fleet could be scattered by fog, the ships losing one another and drifting apart to find when the murk lifted that they were strung out across miles of empty water, or that some were simply gone, lost in the blindness, never to rejoin. The fog and the calm were the sea's quieter cruelties, less violent than the storm, but unsettling in their own deep way. And the men feared them too, in their fashion, the blindness and the stranding and the vast indifferent silence of the deep. Yet the sea was not done with the men with mere stillness, for the wind that had died would return, and return in anger, until the sea, which had been by turns vast and tedious and eerily still, decides to show the men what it can truly do. It begins as bad weather at sea so often does, with a change a seaman feels before he can name it, a shift in the wind, a new and heavier run to the swell, a darkening and a lowering of the sky away to one quarter. The steersman watches it, and the older men watch it, and a word goes round the ship, and the easy mood is gone. In a moment every man alert, now the gear made fast, the sail shortened or struck, and then the weather comes. The wind rises to a howl, flinging the spray in stinging sheets, and the sea, which was heaving before, begins to truly run. The swells building higher and steeper, until they are moving walls of grey-black water that lift the ship sickeningly up and up to their crests, and then drop her down into the troughs between. So that for a moment you are walled in by water on every side, the sky a narrow strip far above. The ship works and groans in it, twisting, the timbers flexing, the sea coming aboard now in earnest. Green water sluicing over the side and surging cold about your feet, and there is no thought now of anything but the ship and the sea and staying alive. You bail. That is the work in a storm, the endless desperate bailing, scooping the water out faster than it comes in, for a ship that fills will founder, and so you bail with whatever there is, leather buckets passed hand to hand, working past exhaustion, because to stop is to drown. The steersman fights the steering oar to keep her bow on to the great seas, for if a wave takes her broadside, she will roll and go over. And his is the hardest and most vital labour of all, holding the ship's life in his two hands. The men at the oars pull, when they are told, to give the steersman steerage way, or ship their oars and bail, when that is the need, all of them soaked and freezing and frightened and working with the strength of fear. And the other ships of the fleet are lost to view in the murk and the flying spray, each one alone now in the chaos, and you do not know, in the thick of it, whether they are riding it out as you are, or going down one by one in the dark of the squall, and there is no way to know, and no help you could give if you did. And then, in its own time, the weather eases. The wind drops by degrees from a howl to a hard blow to a stiff breeze. The seas stop building and begin to lengthen and gentle. The murk thins, and at last there is grey daylight again, and a heaving, but no longer murderous sea. And the men can stop bailing and slump at last over their oars, spent past beaking, shaking with cold and the ebbing of fear. The ship has come through. She is half full of water, and her gear is in disorder, and the men are wrung out to nothing. But she swims, and the men in her are alive. And slowly, across the clearing sea, the other ships of the fleet come back into view, here and there, riding the swell, having come through it too, or most of them. For the sea takes its toll on such a crossing, and there may be a ship or two that does not answer the count. It is a sobering thing, the morning after a storm at sea, the gratitude and the grief mixed, the knowing how close it came. But the worst is behind you now, and the sea has spent its anger, and somewhere ahead, closer with every hour, lies the shore. Rest then, and dry as you can in the returning light, for the next thing the lookout sees, after all these days of water, will change everything. It comes, when it comes, as a cry from the bow. A man standing in the prow, shading his eyes, stiffens and stares, and then calls back down the ship the word that every soul aboard has been aching to hear for days, the word that land has been sighted, low on the horizon ahead. A darker line lying along the rim of the grey sea, where before there was only water meeting sky. And every man who can leave his oar comes up to look, crowding toward the bow, straining their eyes at that thin dark line, and a sound goes through the ship that is half a cheer and half a long breath let out. The sound of an enormous tension breaking, for the crossing is nearly over, the sea is nearly crossed, and there, at last, after all the cold and the wet and the fear and the longing, is the realm. It is not much to look at yet, that first sight of England, only a low smudge along the horizon, grey-green and indistinct, hardening slowly out of the haze as the ship draws on toward it, through the long afternoon. But to the men watching it grow, it is everything. It is the end of the sea. It is solid ground and an end to the heaving. It is warmth and fire and dry land to lie on, and it is the goal of the whole venture. The rich country they have crossed the world to take, lying there ahead of them, real now, no longer a tale told through a winter, but a true coast rising out of the sea before their eyes. There is a hunger in the way the men look at it, a fierce and complicated wanting, for that low green line holds everything they have come for, the kingdom and the wealth and the new life, and it holds danger too. For it is not an empty country, but a peopled one, with its own kings and its own warriors who will not give it up easily. And here, rising at last out of the haze, is the very coast we spoke of at the beginning of this night, the low green shore that does not yet know you are coming. Somewhere beyond that hardening line are the farms and the churches and the people going about their day, the kings in their halls, the monks at their prayers, none of them yet aware that out on the grey water a fleet is bearing down upon them that will, before the year has turned, overturn the whole order of their world. They cannot see you yet. They do not know. The shore lies quiet and unwarned under the afternoon light, going about its ancient business as it has for generations, while toward it, low and dark and many, come the ships that will end one age of this realm and begin another. There is a strange weight in that, in being the thing the unknowing shore does not yet see coming. The future bearing down on a land that thinks itself safe, and the men feel it in their way. The sense of carrying a great and terrible change toward a coast that does not know it is about to receive it. But that is for later. For now there is only the realm, rising slowly out of the sea, and the ship driving toward it, and the long crossing all but done. Let us draw on toward that coast with them, and feel what it is to come in at last to a foreign shore. The run into the coast is slow and careful, for a shore is the most dangerous part of any voyage. and a fleet does not simply drive at the ground and hope. As the coast hardens out of the haze, the steersmen study it, reading the line of it, the set of the surf, the lie of the headlands, looking for the thing every seaman wants, a sheltered place to come in, a river mouth, or a bay, or a stretch of open beach, where the ships can ground in safety and the men can land without the surf smashing the hulls or the rocks tearing them open. The fleet draws together as it nears the region, the scattered ships gathering in, for there is safety in numbers on a hostile coast, and the leaders' ships take the lead, feeling the way in. The water changes under you as the deep gives way to the shallows, its colour shifting from the slate grey of the open sea to a greener, browner, more troubled hue, and you can smell the kingdom now. The green growing smell of earth and trees and smoke coming off it on the wind, the smell of a country after days of nothing but salt. And there is a question in every mind as the coast hardens, which is simply where they have come to, for the crossing was made by craft and reckoning, and not by any certain knowledge. And a fleet that set out for a stretch of coast might well make its landfall many miles north or south of where it meant to. So the steersmen study the shore, not only for a safe place to land, but for any sign of where on the long coast they are. A headland they might know, the mouth of a river they have heard tell of, anything to fix their place against the tales and the scraps of knowledge they carry of this region. Often enough they cannot be sure, and must simply take the coast as they find it, land where they can, and learn afterward, from a captured man or from their own ranging, what part of the realm they have come to. There is a strange blindness in it, arriving by sea at an unknown point on a hostile shore, not quite certain even what kingdom's land you are about to set foot in. And it sharpens the wariness of the landing, the sense of stepping into the unknown, not merely in general, but in the most literal way, onto a piece of ground you cannot yet name. And as you come in close, the coast resolves from a smudge into a true shore, and you see England for the first time with your own eyes, near enough to make out. There are low cliffs in places, and stretches of beach, and behind them the territory rolls away, green and wooded and gentle, softer and richer looking than the harder country many of these men come from. A fat and pleasant country, even at first sight. There is woodland, dark stands of it running down toward the shore. There are open fields, the worked ground of a farming people, and here and there the thin rise of smoke from a steading or a village, the marks of habitation, the sign that this is no empty wilderness, but a settled and a peopled land. Full of the very wealth the men have come to take, the men look at it hungrily as it nears this green and prosperous country, and you can feel the want come off them, the sense that here is the prize lying open before them, rich and ready, if they have the strength and the luck to take it. The ships feel for the shore, now the oars out, the men pulling slow and watchful, the leadsman sounding the depth where there is doubt, the steersman easing the hulls in toward the chosen landing through the last of the swell. The surf builds as the water shallows, the long rollers heaving in toward the beach and breaking white, and the ships ride in on them. Lifting on the back of a wave and surging forward, the men pulling hard now to keep her straight and drive her up. For the moment of grounding is the tricky one, and a ship that comes in crooked can broach and roll in the surf and spill her men and gear into the breakers. But these are seamen of long skill, and they bring the ships in true, riding the surf. And the moment comes, the keel touches. There is a long grinding shudder as the bottom of the ship strikes the sand and shingle of the beach and drives up it, slowing the way coming off her until she grounds and stops. Fast on the shore, heeling a little, the surf breaking and hissing around her stern. And the men are over the side in an instant, the ones in the bow leaping down into the shallow water and the wet sand, splashing ashore. Others swinging over to haul the ship higher up the beach beyond the reach of the waves. The first man over the bow drops down onto the wet sand of England and feels the solid ground take his weight after all the days of the heaving sea. And that is a moment to hold. The first footfall on the foreign shore, the strange firmness of land under feet that have forgotten it. The small stagger as the body expects the deck to move and finds instead the unmoving earth. There is a change that happens to a man in that instant that he does not forget. The first touch of solid ground after a long crossing, and it is stranger and stronger than you might think. After days on the living, moving, treacherous sea, the simple unmoving solidity of the ground comes almost as a shock, a thing the body can hardly believe. The ground does not rise and fall. It does not roll. It is simply there, firm and still and dependable, holding you up without effort, and the relief of it floods through a man so deeply that his legs go weak with it. And more than one hard warrior has knelt on the foreign sand in those early moments. Not in prayer, but simply because his body could no longer hold him up for the sheer relief of being delivered from the sea. The smell of the country comes to him. The green growing smell of earth and leaf, so different from the clean cold emptiness of the salt water. The sounds of the land come, the birds, the wind in real trees, the small noises of a living country. And under it all is the solid, blessed, unmoving earth. Taken at last, after days of longing for it, the crossing survived, the sea behind him, the ground of the new country beneath his feet. At last, come over the side yourself then. Down into the cold, shallow water and up onto the beach, and stand a moment on the region you have crossed the world to reach. The ground seems to heave and tilt under you for a while, the sea still moving in your blood, the body needing time to learn the country again. The cold, wet sand is firm beneath your boots. The smell of the country is all around you, green and earthy and strange. And behind you, the surf breaks, and the ships ground one after another all along the beach, the whole fleet coming in, ship after ship, driving up the sand and spilling its men, until the shore that was empty a little while ago is alive with hundreds of men, wading ashore, hauling up the boats, gathering their gear. A whole army landing on a foreign coast in the failing light of the day. You have crossed the sea, you are in England, and whatever comes now, the great venture has reached its shore. Let us look at what these first hours on the foreign beach are like, for they are wary and watchful ones. The first hours ashore are not the wild plundering rush that the frightened tales would have you imagine. They are careful, watchful, almost anxious, for the men have come ashore on a strange and hostile coast in the last of the daylight. And the first need is not loot but safety. The land is unknown. Somewhere beyond those green fields and dark woods are the people of this land and their lord and his warriors, who may already have seen the fleet come in, who may be gathering even now to fall on the invaders before they can establish themselves. And so the immediate business is to secure the landing, to get the ships safe up the beach, to gather the men together off the open sand, to post watchers on the high ground and at the wood's edge, to make ready in case the country comes against them in the night. The men work fast in the fading light. The ships are hauled up beyond the tide and made fast. The gear is brought ashore and gathered. The leaders move among the men, ordering them, telling off parties to watch and parties to forage and parties to begin a rough camp. The long habit of war showing in the speed and order of it. For these men have done this before and know what the early hours on a hostile shore demand. There is a tension over everything, a coiled wariness, eyes turning often to the dark line of the woods and the rising ground inland. Ears pricked for any sound of men gathering. A landing is the moment of greatest danger in such a venture. The army strung out and weary and not yet established, and every man feels it and works the faster for it. And there is, beneath the weariness, the strange flat exhaustion that comes after the crossing. The body wrung out by days of cold and wet and fear and labour suddenly come to rest on solid ground and hardly knowing what to do with itself. Men move heavily, slowly, their limbs leaden, their minds dulled. The land still seems to heave underfoot. The simple solid stillness of the earth, after so long on the moving sea, is almost more than the body can take in. And yet there is no rest yet, not truly, for the camp must be made and the watch set before any man can lie down. And so the weary men work on into the dusk, securing their foothold on the edge of the kingdom they have come to take, while the light goes and the unknown ground darkens around them, and the first night in England comes on. And that first night ashore is a thing apart, neither the broken sleep of the ship nor the settled rest of the camps that would come later, but a wary, watchful, half-sleeping vigil on the edge of a hostile shore. The men gather close, off the open beach, in whatever rough shelter they can throw up among the dunes or at the wood's edge, the ships drawn up and guarded at their backs, the sea behind them and the unknown country before. Small fires are lit, low and shielded, enough to warm a little and to cook a little, but not so great as to throw their light far across the dark land and tell the ground where the strangers lie. The men eat what there is and ease their salt-stiffened limbs by the small flames, and feel, for the first time in days, the blessed solidity of unmoving ground beneath them, even as their bodies still rock with the memory of the sea. But there is little true ease in it, for the night is full of unknowing. This is a strange country, and a dark one, and somewhere out in that darkness are its people and its warriors, who may be gathering even now, who may come down upon the camp in the black hours when men are weakest. So the watch is set, men posted out at the edges of the firelight and beyond it, staring into the gloom, listening, while their fellows snatch what sleep they can. And the sleeping men sleep light, their weapons at their hands, half listening even in their dreams, for the cry that would mean the realm had come for them. Every sound out in the blackness, the call of a night bird, the bark of a fox, the wind in the strange trees, brings heads up and hands to hilts, until it is named and dismissed, and the wary half-sleep resumes. Lie among them then, that first night wrapped in your damp cloak on the foreign ground, the small fire dying to embers, the sea sighing on the shingle at your back, and the black unknown shore breathing before you. You are too tired not to sleep, and too uneasy for true rest, and so you drift in and out, surfacing at every sound, sinking again, the long day's crossing and landing replaying behind your closed eyes, the heave of the sea still in your blood. It is a strange threshold, that first night, the old life of the sea behind you, and the new life of the conquest not yet truly begun. The men poised on the very edge of the realm they have come to take, holding their small, wary foothold through the dark until the dawn. Hold it a moment, that watchful night on the rim of England, and then let us go forward into the days that followed, and see what these men did with the foothold they had won, beginning with the thing they needed first of all, which was not gold but horses. The thing the army needed most, once ashore and secure, was not silver and not food, but horses. And the getting of horses was among the very earliest works of the campaign. For it was horses that turned a force of sea-borne raiders into something far more dangerous, an army that could move. A man on foot is slow, tied to the coast, easily caught and easily avoided. A man on a horse can range, can strike inland and be gone before the region can gather against him, can cover in a day what a marching column covers in 3, can choose where to fight and where not to. The leaders of this host understood that better than anyone, and so the early days were given over to seizing horses from the kingdom round about, taking the beasts from the farms and the steadings within reach. gathering mounts enough to set the army on the move. It is worth pausing on, for it tells you what kind of war this was going to be. These men had not come to sit on a beach and raid the nearest church. They had come to take a country, and to take a country you must be able to go where the wealth and the power are, to the inland towns and the royal seats, and for that you need to move fast and far, and for that you need horses. So they took them, riding out in parties to the farms, driving off the beasts, until the host had remounts enough for its purpose. They were not, for the most part, cavalry in the way later ages would know it. Men who fought from the saddle. They used the horses to travel, to range and to raid at speed, and then dismounted to fight on foot in the old way, shield to shield. But the horses gave them the thing that mattered. The reach and the speed that let a single army hold a whole country in fear, striking here and then far away there, never where it was looked for, always gone before the levies could come up. And the taking of the horses was the land's first true taste of what had landed on its shore. Until then, the people inland might have heard only rumour, a fleet seen off the coast, ships beached somewhere to the east. Now the riders came, into the farms and the villages, taking the beasts, taking what else they wanted, and the word spread inland ahead of them, fast and fearful, that the heathen host was come and was on the move, and no one knew where it would strike. Hold that, as you watch the riders go out and the horses come in, the way a thing as ordinary as a herd of farm beasts became the hinge of a conquest. And the way the war began, not with a great battle, but with parties of horsemen riding out across a frightened country in the grey light of a northern autumn. And the horses were only half of how this host moved. For the other half was the very thing that had carried it across the sea, the ships, and here is a part of the venture that is easy to miss. The country these men had landed in was threaded with rivers, broad, easy waterways running up from the coast, deep into the heart of the land. And the shallow-drawing ships of the north were made for exactly such water. A vessel that had crossed the open ocean could also be rowed far up a river into the interior of the realm, carrying its warband, swiftly and by surprise, to places far from the sea that thought themselves safe. And so the host used the rivers as roads, pushing inland along them, the ships nosing up the brown water between the wooded banks, deep into a country that had never imagined an enemy could reach it by such a way. To be aboard for one of those river passages was a strange and a watchful thing, utterly unlike the open sea crossing. The water was calm here, sheltered. The ship gliding between close green banks, where before there had been only the vast heave of the ocean, and the land pressed in on either hand, near enough to see the trees and the reeds, and now and then the works of men. A steading on a rise, a church tower above the woods, a village that fell silent and emptied at the sight of the dark hulls coming up the river. The men rode quietly, watchfully, for a river is a narrow place, and an ambush is easy on it. And there was a coiled tension to the passage. The warband gliding deeper into hostile country with the banks crowding close. But the reward was the surprise of it, the falling upon some inland place that had felt itself far beyond the reach of any sea raider. The host appearing out of the river like a thing from a nightmare, where no enemy was ever looked for. By horse over the land and by ship up the rivers, then the host could reach almost anywhere it chose, and that reach was the secret of its terror. For nowhere in the whole realm was truly safe from it. A coastal people might guard their coast and think themselves secure inland. A river town might trust to its distance from the sea. And the host would come, by the road or the water, fast and unlooked for, and be among them before the alarm could spread. It is one thing to face an enemy who must come at you by a known road, and quite another to face one who can come by land or water, by day or night, from any quarter, and who is gone again before you can gather to meet him. That was the host, ranging the region by horse and by river, and the kingdom could find no rest from it. Now let us look at the land itself, at what England was to the men who had come to take it, for it struck them, this realm, as a rich and a pleasant place. England, to the men who had crossed the sea to it, was a fat country, a rich and gentle and prosperous land, and they felt the wealth of it almost at once, in the very look of the ground. Many of these men came from harder country, from the thin soils and the short summers and the rocky shores of the north, where a living was wrung from the land by hard labour, and there was never quite enough, where a bad year meant hunger, and the younger sons had no ground to inherit at all. And here was England, green and well-watered, and warm by comparison, its soil deep and its fields broad, a country that grew grain in plenty and pastured fat cattle, and carried, scattered across it, a dense and settled population, living far better than the folk at home. To eyes used to scarcity, it was a realm flowing with riches, and the wealth was everywhere, in the worked fields and the fat herds, in the well-built halls of the lords, and above all in the churches and the monasteries, which held, in their gold and their silver and their fine things, a concentration of treasure such as the north had never dreamed of. The country was thick with people too, far more thickly settled than home, the land carved up into worked fields and meadows, and managed woodland dotted with villages and steadings, and the halls of the local lords, threaded with the tracks and roads by which the people moved between them. It was an old and ordered realm, long settled, long worked, with the marks of generations on it, the field banks and the trackways and the churches that had stood for lifetimes. And it was Christian, holy Christian, which struck the heathen newcomers as strange, a country given over to the one God of the southern faith. Its life centred on its churches and its monasteries, its calendar marked by the holy days, its wealth gathered into the houses of its priests and monks. To the men of the host, who held to the old gods, this was a foreign thing, and a useful one. For the churches that the English held sacred were to the raiders simply storehouses of undefended treasure, rich and poorly guarded, the easiest and the most profitable of all targets. And there was, scattered across this old country, something stranger still to the eyes of the newcomers, the works of a people older even than the English. For long before there had been a folk in this realm that built in stone on a scale no one now living could match, and the wreck of their works lay everywhere. There were the roads, above all, the great straight paved roads, driving across the realm from town to town, mile upon mile of them, laid down ages before, and still after all the centuries, the firmest and surest ways through the land. And the host used them gladly, riding their warbands swiftly along the old stone roads to fall upon places the road builders had never dreamed of. There were the towns those builders had raised, some still lived in, some fallen to ruin, with their walls of dressed stone and their crumbling gates, and the broken stumps of buildings grander than anything the men had seen, standing silent and overgrown, the work of hands long dead. To the newcomers, who built in timber and earth and turf and raised nothing in stone, these labours were a wonder and a mystery, almost beyond belief that mere men could have made them. There is a feeling among these people, caught in their own old verses, that such ruins were the handiwork of giants, the labour of some mightier race of an elder age, now perished and gone, leaving only their vast stone bones scattering the land for lesser men to wonder at. To ride through a half-ruined stone town, its walls towering and broken, the wind moaning through the empty gateways, the great works crumbling slowly back into the earth, was to feel the deep age of this country, the sense of peoples come and gone before, of a land that had been won and lost and won again across ages beyond reckoning. And there was a lesson in it, had the men paused to read it, for they too were a people come to take this ground, and they too would one day be old bones, and crumbling works, and half-remembered names, as the giants were, the realm outlasting them all. But men bent on conquest do not pause for such thoughts, and the host rode on along the giants' roads, deeper into the rich old country, toward the wealth it had come to take. So the land that the men looked on, as they began to range across it, was a country richer and softer and more crowded than their own, full of wealth gathered and waiting. A prize worth the crossing and the danger many times over. And you can feel, in the way the sources tell of it, the hunger that the sight of it woke in them, the sense of a rich house with the door left open, a fat and prosperous country that did not seem able to defend itself against a force as fast and as ruthless as the one that had landed on it. That hunger was about to be fed. But before we follow the host inland to the feeding of it, let us look at the people of this country. The English themselves glimpsed in those first days, for they are easy to forget in a tale told from the raiders' side, and they should not be forgotten. The people of the region are everywhere in this story and almost nowhere named. The farmers and the villagers and the townsfolk and the monks whose land this was and whose lives were about to be overturned by the host that had come ashore. Glimpse them as the army would have glimpsed them in those first days. At a distance mostly, fearful figures seen across a field or fleeing down a track, a farmer driving his beasts away into the woods at the rumour of riders, a village emptying as the word came, the people taking what they could carry and hiding in the forest or the marsh, abandoning their homes to the mercy of the strangers. For the coming of the host was, to them, a catastrophe out of the sea, sudden and merciless, falling on an ordinary working country, going about its ordinary year. And the terror of it ran ahead of the riders like a wind through corn. These were not soft or foolish people, nor were they strangers to hardship, for life in that age was hard for everyone. But they were not, for the most part, warriors. They were farmers and craftsmen and traders and churchmen, people whose lives were bound to the land and the seasons and the church. And they had no answer ready for an army of hardened fighting men come suddenly among them with horses and steel. Their defence was their king and his warriors, the fighting men of the kingdom, and these would gather and would give battle in time. But the gathering took time, and in the meantime the kingdom folk could only run, or hide, or submit, or fall, as the host swept through. And many of them did all of these in turn, through the years that followed. It is right to hold them in mind, the people of the land, as the host begins its work, for the wealth that the men had crossed the sea to take was their wealth, and the realm that was about to be broken was their country, and the cost of the venture was to be paid, in the end, by them. I will not dwell on the cruelty of it, for these stories are owed restraint as well as truth, and the cruelty was real. The host killed where it met resistance, and where killing served its purpose. It burned. It took captives to be sold as slaves, for the slave trade was part of the wealth of this world, and the host dealt in it as readily as in silver. The churches and the monasteries, those undefended storehouses of treasure, were plundered and their communities scattered or slain. And the monks who survived to write the chronicles remembered the heathen with a horror that has come down through all the centuries since. That was the other face of the venture. The face the men on the beach did not speak of as they loaded the boats, the misery their coming meant for the people of the land. Hold it plainly, as part of the truth of this night, the suffering woven through the daring, and then let us go on, and follow the host as it does the thing it came to do, and turns the country's riches to its own purpose. But before we come to that treasure, pause a moment on the strangest thing in this country to the eyes of the men who had come to take it, which was its faith, and the great houses that faith had raised. For England was a Christian realm, wholly given over to the worship of the one God of the South, and the heart of that worship lay in its churches, and above all in its monasteries, the houses of the monks, which were unlike anything the heathen newcomers knew. A monastery was a settlement of men who had given their lives wholly to their God, living together under a rule, spending their days in prayer and in labour and in the copying of their holy books, set apart from the ordinary world behind their walls. And over the generations these houses had grown rich, very rich, for the pious had given to them without cease lands and treasure and gold, until the monasteries held in their churches and their storerooms a concentration of wealth such as existed nowhere else in the land. To the heathen, this was a marvel and a puzzle and an opportunity all at once. They came from a world where wealth was guarded by warriors, kept in strong halls, defended by the swords of those who held it. And here were these houses, stuffed with gold and silver, with jeweled books and holy vessels of precious metal, with all the accumulated gifts of generations, and guarded by nothing at all but the awe of the God whose houses they were, by monks who carried no weapons and would offer no fight. To a Christian, the monastery was sacred, untouchable, protected by a power greater than any sword. To the heathen, who did not fear that God and felt no awe of those walls, it was simply the richest and the softest target imaginable. A storehouse of treasure, with the door standing open and no one to guard it. And so the monasteries suffered terribly in these years, their wealth stripped away, their communities scattered, the holy houses that had stood for generations broken open and emptied. And the horror of it filled the writings of the churchmen who survived. For to them it was not merely robbery, but sacrilege, the violation of the holy by the godless, an evil almost beyond understanding. There is the deep clash of two worlds in it, the heathen who saw only undefended gold, and the Christian who saw the desecration of all he held sacred. The two peoples looking at the very same walls and seeing things so utterly opposed. It was in its way a clash of gods as much as of armies. The old powers of the north loosed upon the houses of the southern god, and the men of the host felt no guilt in it, for these were not their holy places and not their God, only riches lying open for the taking. Now let us follow that taking, and see how a whole country came to pay the heathen to leave it be. One of the strangest weapons in the host's hands was not steel at all, but fear, and the fear was turned into silver by a simple and a brutal arrangement. The payment that later ages came to call the Danegeld. For a country that could not beat the host in the field, or that wished to spare itself the ruin of trying, had another way to be rid of it, at least for a season, and that was to pay it to go away. The leaders of the host would offer terms to a king or a town or a region whose land they threatened, give us so much silver, so much treasure, so much tribute, and we will not burn your country. We will move on. We will leave you in peace. And again, the English paid. They stripped the silver from their churches and their treasuries. They gathered the wealth of a region, and they handed it over to the heathen, buying a respite, buying the host's departure, buying time. It was a bitter bargain, and it bought less than it seemed to, for the silver that bought peace this year only fed and strengthened the host for the wars of next year, and an army that learned it could be paid to leave, learnt also to come back and be paid again. But to a king, with no forcible to meet the host in battle, or unwilling to risk all on a single fight, it could seem the lesser ruin, the price of a breathing space, and so the Danegeld was paid, over and over. Through these years, vast sums of silver, passing from the churches and the coffers of England into the war chests of the host. For the men of the army, it was wealth almost without risk, treasure handed to them for the mere threat of violence, and it made the venture pay, even in the seasons when there was little fighting. To stand in the host and see the tribute brought in, the chests of hacked silver and coin and church plate carried into the camp and shared out, was to understand that the country was not merely being raided, but milked. Drained of its wealth season by season, paying its conquerors to bleed it. And the silver, once gained, was shared and weighed and hoarded in the way these people dealt with all their riches, by weight rather than by count. The coins and the cut pieces and the broken ornaments measured out on the little folding scales that every man of substance carried. A warrior's share of a great tribute could make him rich, could be the foundation of the standing and the land he dreamed of, and so the men had every reason to follow the venture and to make it pay. For each payment brought their own goal nearer. Hold that, the cold arithmetic beneath the terror, the way a country's fear was turned, chest by chest, into the silver that filled the warriors' hands and bought, in the end, the very land they meant to settle. Yet it would be wrong to leave you thinking the country simply lay down and let itself be taken, for it did not, and the men of the host knew well enough that England had teeth. The kingdoms of the English were old, and ordered realms with kings and warriors of their own, and when the host came against them, they did not always pay, and they did not always flee. But again and again they gathered and fought. Each kingdom had its fighting men, the warriors of the king's own household, hardened and well armed, and behind them the levy of the land. The free men called out to bear arms in the kingdom's defence, who could be summoned in their thousands when the need came. They knew their own country as the invaders never could, the roads and the rivers and the fords and the hidden ways, and they fought, when they fought, for their homes and their families and their faith, which is a thing that lends a desperate strength to even an outmatched man. So the conquest was no easy walk, but a hard, grinding war of years, with battles won and lost on both sides. With English kings who rallied their people and met the host in the field and sometimes beat it back, with the invaders themselves taking losses they could ill afford so far from home. There were defeats for the host as well as victories, hard-fought days when the English wall held and the heathen were the ones who broke and ran, leaders of the host killed, war bands shattered. And there was one kingdom above all, the southern realm. That would not break however hard it was pressed, that fought on through disaster after disaster under a young king who would not yield, and that in the end found the strength not merely to survive the host, but to turn upon it and begin, slowly, to win back what had been lost. It is right to hold that in mind, the courage of the defenders, for a tale told only from the side of the host can make the English seem mere victims, fleeing or paying or falling. And they were far more than that. They were a brave and a stubborn people, fighting for their land against a terrible enemy, and though they lost much and suffered terribly, they were never wholly beaten, and in the end, it was their endurance, their refusal to give up the struggle, that set the limit on the conquest and saved a part of the country to fight another day. The men of the host respected that, in their way, for they were warriors and they knew courage when they met it. And the long war they fought in England was a war against men as brave and as determined as themselves. Now let us look at the army itself in motion, for the thing that made all of this possible, the tribute and the plunder and the breaking of kingdoms, was the way this host could move and strike. The host, once mounted and provisioned, became a thing the like of which the English had not faced before, and to be part of it on the move was to feel its peculiar strength. It was not a lumbering army of the old kind, tied to its supply and its line of march, easy to find and to meet in the field. It was fast, and it was elusive, and it was held together by a hard discipline beneath its fierce reputation. It would gather in strength, strike where it chose, take a town or a district, gather its plunder or its tribute, and then move. Often before the country could bring a force against it, riding hard to some new quarter and falling on it before word of the last blow had even spread. It used the rivers and the old roads, it seized strong points and fortified them, it wintered where it pleased in fortified camps that no hasty levy could storm, and it broke the kingdoms of the English one by one. not in a single great battle, but in a long campaign of movement and pressure and shrewd, ruthless calculation. And the calculation was the heart of it, for these leaders were not merely fierce, they were cunning, and they made war like men playing a long game for high stakes. They picked off the kingdoms one at a time, rather than uniting them in a common cause against a common foe. They exploited the divisions of the English, the rivalries between kingdoms and the quarrels over thrones, taking a side in a disputed succession here, setting up a puppet there, dividing where they could not simply conquer. They knew when to fight and when to take tribute and move on, when to press and when to wait. And in this way, kingdom by kingdom, the host broke the power of the English, until of the great realms only one still stood unbroken, and the whole weight of the venture came at last to bear upon it. To ride with the host in these years was to feel yourself part of something that seemed almost unstoppable, a force that went where it would and took what it wanted and beat down, one after another, the powers of a great and wealthy land. I will not stage the battles for you, for they were brutal, and these are not stories for the dwelling on of slaughter, and the plain fact of the matter is enough. Kingdoms fell. Kings were killed in battle, or driven from their thrones, or made to bend the knee. Whole regions passed under the hand of the host, their old rulers gone, their wealth taken, their land held now by the heathen who had come out of the sea. It was a conquest, real and lasting. The breaking of an old order and the imposing of a new, and it was done in a handful of years by an army that had come ashore on a beach with nothing but its ships and its weapons and its will. That was the venture you had joined, leaning on your oar on that grey morning, and this was where it led. To the breaking of a country and the winning of a share in it. And since we have spoken of the fighting without looking at it, let us look, once with restraint, at how these men fought when it came to a true battle. For it tells you much about them, and it was nothing like the wild individual fury the tales would lead you to expect. The men of the north fought, when armies met, in a locked formation, the shield wall, the close-packed rank of men that was the heart of warfare in this age. The warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their round shields overlapping, each man's shield guarding his own left side and his neighbour's right, so that the rank became a single unbroken barrier of wood and iron, bristling with spear points, a hedge of men that the enemy must break or be broken upon. It was not a matter of dashing heroics, but of nerve and discipline and the strength to stand, for a shield wall won not by brilliance, but by holding, by the refusal of the men in it to break and run. To stand in that rank was the supreme test of a warrior, and it asked a particular and a terrible kind of courage, the courage simply to stay. You stood in the formation, your shield locked with the men to either side, the enemy a little way off doing the same, and there was a wait, often a long dreadful wait, the two hosts facing each other, the shouting and the threats and the working up of nerve before they closed. And then they came together, shield grinding on shield, the men heaving and shoving and stabbing over and under the rims, and it became a contest of pure endurance and pressure and will, the two formations locked and straining, each trying to break the other, to make some part of the opposing rank waver and give and crumble, for once such a barrier broke and the men began to run, the battle was lost and the slaughter began. The whole art and terror of it lay in that, in standing when every instinct screamed to run, in holding fast for your sworn fellows as they held fast for you, shield to shield, until the other side broke first. I will say no more of what followed a breaking, for that is the part these stories leave decently in shadow, but hold the picture of the shield wall itself. For it is the truest image of how these men made war, and of what bound them, the locked rank of shields, each man's life depending on the steadiness of the men beside him. the whole fellowship of the war band made visible in that single straining barrier of wood and iron and nerve. It was not the work of savages, but of disciplined and desperately brave men, and it was in such struggles, holding or breaking, that the kingdoms of England were won and lost. But an army at war must also rest and winter and live, and it is to the camp that we turn now, for the host did not always march, and the long settled seasons in the great fortified camps were as much a part of this life as the fighting. Let us go into the winter camp and see how the host lived when it was not on the move. When the campaigning season ended, or when the host needed to rest and refit and hold a region through the winter, it built itself a camp, and these were no mere huddles of tents, but great fortified works, small towns almost, thrown up by the labour of the whole army and made strong enough that no English force could hope to storm them. The host would choose its ground with a soldier's eye, a place that could be defended, often a bend in a river or a spit of land with water on most sides, so that the army need only wall off the landward approach. And then the men set to digging, raising a great bank and ditch around the chosen ground, a rampart of piled earth topped with a timber palisade, enclosing the camp within a strong perimeter, with the ships drawn up under its protection and the river guarding its flanks. It was hard labour, the moving of all that earth, but the men did it willingly enough, for a strong camp meant safety through the dark months, and a place from which to dominate the country round about. And the building of the winter camp came, often enough, as the year itself was turning toward the dark, which gave the labour an added weight, for the men were racing the season. The campaigning was the work of the warm months, when the roads were dry and the country could feed an army on the move. And as the autumn drew on, the days shortening, the leaves turning and falling from the English woods, the first frosts whitening the mornings, the host knew it must find its ground and dig itself in before the weather closed down the year. There was a beauty to it, the English autumn, the woods going gold and bronze and red, the mists lying in the river valleys in the early mornings, the harvest gathered in the fields the army had not burned, a softer and a richer turning of the year than the harsh quick slide into winter the men had known at home. But there was a warning in it too, the shortening light, the deepening cold, the year drawing in, and the men worked the harder at their rampart and their shelters to be ready when it came. And then the frozen months settled over the camp and the country, and the world shrank to the firelit dark within the rampart. The short grey days, the long black nights, the cold that crept in from the frozen ground and the iron sky, the rain and the sleet, and sometimes the snow lying over the camp and the silent country beyond. The roads turned to mud and then to ice. The rivers ran high and cold, and the army, that had ranged so freely in the warm months, drew in upon itself and waited, shut up behind its wall with its fires and its stores and its plunder, while the dark season ran its course. It was a strange, enforced stillness for men of action, the long waiting out of the winter, and it pressed on them, the confinement and the chill and the gloom. But it was the rhythm of the war, the fierce movement of summer and the held breath of winter, year after year, and the men endured it as soldiers in every age have endured the bleak seasons of their wars, by the fire, in the company of their fellows, waiting for the light and the roads to come back. Within the wall, the camp became a settled thing for a season, a temporary town of the host. There were shelters and huts thrown up against the weather, rows of them where the men lived through the winter. There were the ships, hauled up and tended. There were spaces for the horses, and stores of food gathered or seized from the surrounding country, and the war gear of the army, and the accumulated plunder and tribute of the season's work. There were fires, many of them, the smoke rising over the rampart, and the smells of a crowded camp, of wood smoke and cooking and beasts and men living close together. And there was the constant low business of an army at rest. The mending of gear and the tending of weapons, the cooking and the eating, the talk and the games and the quarrels. The whole life of a few thousand fighting men, shut up together behind an earthen wall through the slow turning of a northern year. We know more of these camps than of almost anything else in this story, for the ground remembers them, and those who dig into the past have found them and read them. And what they have found brings the camp strangely to life. They have found the great banks and ditches, the shape of the fortifications still legible in the earth. They have found the things the men dropped and lost and left in their thousands, the broken weapons and the lost ornaments, the tools and the buckles and the pins. They have found the silver, the cut and hacked fragments of the hack silver economy, and the little lid weights the men used to measure it on their scales. Scattered through the camp where the wealth of a conquest was weighed and shared. They have found the gaming pieces, for the men gambled and played through the long idle hours. And they have found, soberingly, the dead. The burials of those who did not survive the season. The warriors laid in the ground with their gear. The witness that the camp was a place of dying as well as of living. That disease and wounds took their steady toll, even when the army was not in the field. For the camp was not all ease, by any means. An army shut up close together through a winter was a breeding ground for sickness, and disease could run through such a camp and kill more men than any battle. The fevers and the fluxes that no one then could cure, carrying off the strong and the weak alike in the crowded, none too clean conditions of a winter camp. There was hunger too, in a hard season, when the country round had been stripped bare and the stores ran low, and men who had crossed the sea to grow rich found themselves cold and lean and waiting out the dark months on short rations far from home. And there was the simple grinding tedium of it, the long enforced idleness of winter quarters, the same faces and the same walls and the same waiting, week after week, until the spring should open the roads again and the campaign resume. The camp was the army's strength and its shelter, but it was also, at times, its prison and its grave, and to camp through one was to know the venture's hardship as fully as any battle could teach it. And it was in the camp, through the idle months, that the venture was truly steered, for somewhere within the rampart, in the greatest of the halls, or about the chief fire, the leaders of the host took counsel together and laid the plans that the spring would carry out. These were the famous men whose names ran through the army and through the fears of the country, the great chieftains who had brought the host across the sea and held it together through the years, hard and cunning and proud, the sons in some cases of sea kings, whose deeds were already the stuff of story. They were not kings of the host in the way a Christian kingdom knew kingship, with absolute command, but rather the foremost among a company of leaders, men whose authority rested on their fame and their success and their followers, and who led the host by agreement and by the weight of their reputations as much as by any settled right. To stand near such a council, even at its edge, was to feel the venture's whole weight gathered into a few men's words. They weighed what the host should do when the roads opened, which kingdom to strike next, whether to fight or to take tribute, where to winter the year after, how to share what had been won. They argued, for they were proud men with their own followings and their own ambitions, and the holding together of so great and so quarrelsome a host took all their cunning. And the men of the army, gathered about their own fires through the long evenings, talked over the same questions, guessing at what the leaders would decide, weighing the chances. For every man's fortune and perhaps his life hung on the choices made in that council, and there was no part of camp life more closely watched than the comings and goings of the great men and the rumours of what they intended. It is worth holding, this picture of the venture being steered from within the winter camp, for it shows you that the host was not a blind force of nature, a storm that simply fell upon the country, but a thing directed by men, by minds, by calculation and ambition and hard strategic sense. The terror that swept the country in the campaigning season was planned here in the firelit halls of the winter camp, by leaders playing a long and ruthless game for the highest stakes there were, the breaking of kingdoms and the winning of a land. And when the plans were laid, and the season turned, and the roads dried, the host would rouse itself from its sheltered quarters and pour out once more to do what the council had decided, until the spring should open the roads again and the campaign resume. And yet for all that, there was a kind of rough good life in the camp too, in the better seasons, and it is worth seeing. For it shows these men as something more than the killers of the chronicles. In the evenings the fires burned, and the men gathered to them, and there was food when there was food to be had, the meat of seized cattle roasting, the bread, the ale brewed or plundered, and the warmth and the company after the cold of the day. There were the games they loved, the board games played with carved pieces, the dice rattling and the wagers laid, the shouts and the laughter over a winning throw. There was the telling of tales, the old stories of gods and heroes, and the deeds of famous men, carried in the memory and told aloud in the firelight as they had been told at home, so that even here, far across the sea in a conquered ground, the men kept the words and the world of their people alive among themselves. And at the heart of the camp's better life was the feast, the great gathering of the warband about the fire when there was cause to celebrate. And these were the nights the men lived for. After a good season, a rich tribute gained, a victory won, a strong point taken, the Lord would feast his followers, and the feast was no small thing, but the very binding of the fellowship made flesh. The cattle were slaughtered and roasted whole. The ale and the plundered wine flowed. The hall, or the open ground within the rampart, filled with the warriors gathered close in the firelight. And the night became a long roar of eating and drinking and boasting and song. The men told over the deeds of the season, each adding his part, the great moments relived and magnified in the telling, the dead remembered, the living praised, the whole shared history of the warband sung back to itself in the warm, crowded dark. And the Lord, at such a feast, did the thing that bound his men to him above all else, which was to give. He opened his hand, the generous Lord, and shared out the wealth of the venture among his followers. The silver and the gold and the fine things won in the season's work, rewarding the brave and the loyal, the open-handed giving that was a Lord's first duty and his surest hold on the hearts of his men. For these people prized generosity in a leader above almost any other quality, and a Lord who gave freely, who feasted his men and loaded them with gifts, was a Lord men would follow to the death and beyond. While a grasping Lord who hoarded what his men had won for him would soon find himself alone. The gift-giving was no mere reward, but a sacred bond, the visible sign of the bond between the Lord and his sworn men, the open hand answering the loyal sword. And a man who received a fine gift from his Lord's hand at the feast received with it a renewal of the deep oath that bound them, and felt it in the warmth of the fire and the ale and the fellowship as the very meaning of his life. These were the nights that made the hardship worth it, the cold and the danger and the long crossing, all redeemed in the warm roar of the feast. The man no longer a lonely soul adrift on a cold sea, but a warrior among his brothers, rewarded by his Lord, his name spoken with honour, belonging wholly to a fellowship that asked everything, and gave, on such a night, everything back. To have feasted so, in a firelit hall in a conquered soil, with silver in your hand and your sword brothers all around, and your Lord's praise in your ears, was to have tasted the very best that this hard life had to offer. And it was a thing a man would remember by his own fire in his old age, long after the silver was spent and the brothers were dead. And there was the talk, endless talk, of the campaign past and the campaign to come, of the wealth won and the wealth still to win, and more as the years passed, of the thing that lay beneath the whole venture, the dream that had drawn so many of them across the sea in the first place, which was not silver at all, but land, for the silver was good, and the plunder was good, but silver is spent, and plunder is scattered, and what lasts? The possession that makes a man and his children after him is land, and it was land, in the end, that most of these men had truly come for. Think again of who they were, the second sons and the landless men, and the younger brothers with no inheritance, the men for whom the home shores had no ground to give. To such a man, the rich broad fields of England were not merely a source of plunder, but a vision of a whole different life, a life he could never have had at home, the lot of a man with acres of his own, a farm, a holding, a place in the world, and something to leave to his sons. And here, in this fat, conquered country, that prospect was suddenly within reach, for a country taken by the sword could be parcelled out among the takers, its soil shared among the warriors of the host, each man given ground of his own in the country he had helped to win. That was the prize beneath all the prizes, the deep lure that had pulled the venture across the sea. And as the conquest took hold and the ground came under the host's hand, the dream began, for many of the men, to come true. Let us follow that dream to the thing it became, and see the warriors of the host become, of all unlikely things, farmers. But first, let us spend the first true night in this conquered country, for you have crossed the sea and ranged the land and wintered in the camp, and it is time, at last, to rest. While we are in the camp, let us look at the daily living of it more closely, beginning with the matter that ruled every soldier's days, then as now, which was food. An army must eat, and a host of thousands eats a prodigious amount, and the feeding of it was a constant labour and a constant worry. In camp and on campaign alike, the men lived off the country, taking what the land could give, and the foraging parties that rode out to gather food were as vital to the venture as any war band. They drove in cattle and sheep and pigs from the farms round about. They emptied the barns and the storehouses of their grain. They took the ale and the cheese and the smoked meat that a settled country lays by for its own winter, and they carried it all back to the camp to feed the host. It was hard on the country, this living off the countryside, for an army eats a region bare and leaves hunger behind it, and the people whose stores were taken faced a lean and bitter winter of their own. But it fed the host, and the host took what it needed without much thought for those it took it from. For that was the way of war in that age, and the strong ate and the weak went without. The food itself, in the camp, was the plain hearty fare of the north made from whatever the country yielded. There was meat, more of it than a poor man ate at home, the flesh of the seized cattle and swine roasted at the fires or boiled in the great cauldrons. For an army that has plundered a fat country eats well in the good seasons. There was bread, baked from the taken grain, dark and heavy. There was pottage, the thick boiled mess of grain and beans, and whatever else came to hand, simmering in the pot. There was fish, from the river that guarded the camp. And there was ale, brewed in the camp or seized from the country, the drink that warmed the evenings and loosened the talk and was as needful to the men's spirits as the food was to their bodies. The men ate together at the fires, in their companies, the war band that fought together, eating together, and the sharing of the food was part of the bond that held them. The rough fellowship of men who had crossed the sea and faced the enemy side by side. It was not always plenty, as we have seen, for a hard winter or a stripped country could bring hunger even to the conquerors. But in the good seasons, in a rich land freshly taken, the men ate as they had never eaten at home, and there was a coarse contentment in it. The full belly and the warm fire and the company of one's sword fellows after the day's work. That was one of the real rewards of the venture, humble as it sounds. A man who had grown up hungry on a thin northern farm, and who now sat at a fire in a conquered realm with roast meat in his hands and ale in his cup and silver in his chest, might well feel that the crossing had been worth it, whatever the danger. Hold that, the simple animal comfort of the fed and resting soldier, and let us turn now to the gear that soldier fought with, for a warrior's weapons were his life and his pride both. Look at your own war gear then, as you sit by the fire in the camp, for a man knew his weapons as he knew his own hands, and they were the most precious things he owned. Chief of all, if you were fortunate and wealthy enough to own one, was the sword, the great weapon of the age, costly and prized beyond almost any possession. Its blade of patterned steel, its hilt worked with silver or bronze. A thing handed down and named and loved, the mark of a warrior of standing. Most men, though, fought not with the sword but with the spear, the commonest weapon of all, a stout ash shaft tipped with an iron head, cheap to make and deadly in a press of men. The weapon of the ordinary warrior in the wall of shields. And there was the axe, the bearded axe of the north, a fearsome close weapon in strong hands, and the long knife every man carried, the sea axe, useful for war and for the 100 tasks of daily living both. For defence there was the shield, the round shield of wood faced with hide, with an iron boss at its centre to guard the hand, the single most important piece of a warrior's gear. For it was the shield that turned the blow, and the shields locked together, that made the wall in which these men fought. A wealthier warrior might own a coat of mail, the byrnie, a shirt of thousands of interlinked iron rings that turned the edge of a weapon, heavy and costly and the prized armour of the age, the gear of a man of means. He might own a helmet of iron to guard the head. But mail and helmet were dear, and many a man went to war with no more than his shield and his spear and his courage, trusting to the wall of his fellows and the favour of the gods to bring him through. The gear was tended with care in the camp, the blades honed and oiled against the rust, the shields mended, the mail cleaned. For a man's life hung on his weapons, and he neglected them at his peril. To handle them was to handle the tools of your trade and the proof of your standing both. And a warrior took a deep pride in good gear, in a fine blade or a well-made shield, the pride of a craftsman in the tools of a deadly craft. Let us turn now from the gear of war to the thing the men leaned on when the gear was not enough, which was their faith, the old gods they carried with them across the sea. For these men were not Christians, and the country they had come to take was, and that difference ran deep, deeper than mere plunder, to the very gods a man trusted his life to. The host held to the old faith of the north, the worship of the old gods, and they carried that faith with them across the sea and into the conquered ground, leaning on it as fighting men in every age have leaned on their gods. There was Odin, the high god, the god of war and of wisdom and of the slain, who gathered the brave dead to his hall, and who was the god above all of warriors and of the fury of battle. And a man going into the wall of shields might call on him for the battle madness that took the fear away. There was Thor, the thunderer, the friend of common men, the god of strength and of protection, whose hammer guarded against the powers of evil, and many a warrior wore at his neck a little hammer of silver or iron, the sign of Thor, a charm and a comfort and a token of his faith. And there was the whole deep belief that lay beneath the gods, the way these people understood the world and a man's place in it, which shaped how they faced the danger of the venture. They believed, many of them, in fate, in a destiny laid down for each man that he could not escape, the hour of his death already fixed, so that there was no use in fearing it and no profit in flinching from it. And a man did better to meet his fate boldly and win honour than to shrink from it and gain nothing but shame. That belief was a kind of armor in itself, for a man who truly held that his death would come at its appointed hour, neither sooner nor later whatever he did, could go into danger with a steadiness that unnerved his enemies. They believed in honor, in the name a man left behind him, in the deeds that would be remembered and sung after he was gone. And to win such a name was worth more than long life to many of them. And they believed in the bonds of oath and kin and loyalty, the sacred ties that held their world together. It was a hard faith, and a brave one, suited to the hard, brave life these men led, and it went with them everywhere, into the ships and the camps and the wall of shields. The old gods of the north, carried into a Christian realm by the men who meant to take it. Let us turn now to the bond that faith helped to hold, the tie between a warrior and his lord and his fellows. For it was that bond, more than anything, that made the host an army and not a mob. What held the host together, beneath the lure of silver and land, was a web of bonds as strong as any iron. The ties of oath and loyalty, and fellowship that bound a warrior to his lord and to the men he fought beside. A warrior did not simply fight for pay. He fought for a lord to whom he had sworn himself. A chieftain whose man he was, bound by a solemn oath of loyalty that was among the most sacred ties his world knew. The lord, for his part, owed his men generosity, the open hand, the giving of gifts and gold and feasting, the sharing out of the plunder and the land, for a lord who did not reward his followers would soon have no followers. And the bond ran both ways, loyalty for generosity, service for reward. To break that bond, to betray one's lord or abandon one's sworn fellows, was the deepest shame a man could fall to, a stain that no length of life could wash out, and most men would sooner die than bear it. And beneath the bond to the Lord ran the closer bond to one's fellows, the men of one's own war band, the company that crossed the sea together, and fought in the wall together, and shared the fire and the food and the danger. These were a man's brothers in all but blood, the men he trusted his life to, and who trusted theirs to him. For in the wall of shields a man's life lay quite literally in the hands of the men to either side of him, in the steadiness of their shields and the courage that kept them from breaking and running. Such a fellowship was forged hard, in shared danger and shared hardship, and it held men together through everything the venture could throw at them. To fight beside the same men, season after season. To know that they would stand, when standing was deadly, and that you would stand for them, was to belong to something a man would die for. And many did. It is one of the things most worth understanding about these men, this web of loyalty and honor and fellowship, for it cuts against the picture of them as a mere savage horde. They were a horde in a sense, and savage enough to those they fell upon. But among themselves they were bound by ties of the deepest seriousness, by oaths held sacred, by a loyalty that ran to death, by a code of honor and a brotherhood of the shield wall that gave their hard lives meaning and held their army together through years of war far from home. A man in the host was not alone. He was bound, sworn, belonging, part of a fellowship that asked everything of him and gave him, in return, a place and a name and brothers who would die at his side. Hold that, the iron fellowship beneath the venture, for it is the answer to how a few thousand men, far from home on foreign soil, kept together long enough to break a country. Now let us follow the years forward and see what became of the venture as the conquest endured. The years passed and the conquest stood, and that in itself was the marvel and the proof of the whole enterprise, for raids had come and gone before, but this stayed. Season by season, the host pressed its advantage, broke the kingdoms one by one, took tribute and took land, until the map of the country was remade. Northumbria in the north fell under the host's hand, its old royal line broken. The heathen masters now of the ancient kingdom, The eastern kingdom of the Angles fell, its king killed, its land taken. The Midland kingdom was broken and partitioned, half of it passing to the host, half left to a puppet who ruled at the heathen's pleasure. Of the great kingdoms of the English, only the southern realm of the West Saxons still stood unbroken, holding out under a young king whose long and desperate struggle against the host would become the stuff of legend, and who, against all likelihood, would in the end hold his kingdom and turn the tide. But that is his story, and ours is the host's, and from the host's side the years were years of triumph, of a venture that had dared the impossible and very nearly achieved it. The conquest of a great and wealthy land by an army come out of the sea. And as the conquest settled, the nature of the venture began to change, for an army cannot remain forever an army, and the men had not crossed the sea only to fight without end. They had come, many of them, for land, and now it was won, and the time came to take it. And so there came a moment recorded plainly in the chronicles of the conquered, that is among the most telling in the whole story. In the conquered north, the leader of the host, a hard, famous chieftain who had brought the army through years of war, did a thing that no mere raider would ever do. He shared out the land. He parcelled the conquered country among his warriors, gave each man his portion of the rich English soil, and the men who had been warriors became, of all things, landholders. Settling down on the ground, they had won to live on it and work it. The Chronicle of the English says it flatly, almost in disbelief, that the heathen shared out the land and proceeded to plough it and to support themselves. And in that plain sentence, the whole venture turns, from conquest to settlement, from raiding to staying, from an army to a people, putting down roots in a new country. Pause on that plain sentence a moment, for there is a whole world folded into it, and the men who wrote it down can hardly have grasped what they were recording. For years the chroniclers had set down the deeds of the heathen in horror. The burnings and the killings and the plunderings, the tribute extorted and the kingdoms broken, the host a scourge out of the sea that fell upon the land and could not be stopped. And now, almost in the same breath, the same dread enemy is recorded, doing the most ordinary and peaceable thing in the world, dividing up land and settling down to plough it, to grow grain, to support themselves by honest farming like any other folk. The scourge had become a neighbour, the raider had become a farmer. The thing that had come to take the country had decided, instead, to live in it. And the bafflement you can almost feel behind the chronicler's flat words is the bafflement of a man watching a force he had thought of as pure destruction reveal itself suddenly as something far stranger and more human. A people who had crossed the sea not merely to plunder, but to find a home. That is the hinge of the whole long tale. The moment the venture changes its nature, and it is worth dwelling on because it is so easily missed. Hidden as it is in a dry line of chronicle between the records of battles. The sharing out of the land was the quiet end of the conquest and the quiet beginning of the settlement. The point at which the army began to dissolve and the people began to form. The sword set down and the plough taken up, and from it flows everything that came after, the farms and the marriages and the children, the town and the trade, the place names and the words and the blood, the whole deep peaceable rooting of the newcomers in the soil they had taken. It all begins here, in this plain sentence about ploughing, the most consequential anticlimax in the entire story, the day the conquerors decided to stay and become in time the country they had conquered. Think what that meant to the man it happened to, the warrior who had crossed the sea years before with nothing but his weapons and his courage and the dream of land. Now the dream was real. Here was ground of his own, broad and rich. English fields that were his to plough, and to keep and to pass to his sons, a holding such as he could never have won in the crowded country of his birth. The sword could be hung up or kept by the door against need, and the hands that had gripped the spear could take up the plough instead. And the man who had been a sea raider became a farmer, a man of the land. Settled at last after all the years of the sea and the war. It is an astonishing turn and a deeply human one. The fierce venture ending not in endless plunder, but in a furrow turned in a quiet field. The warrior's true goal revealed at last to have been, all along, a home. Let us follow him into that new life, for it is stranger and gentler than anything the chronicles of the raids would lead you to expect. The new life of the settled warrior was a thing his younger self, leaning on the oar in the cold dawn of the crossing, could hardly have imagined. He took his portion of the conquered ground, a holding of good English soil, and he set about the slow work of making a life on it, the very work his people had done at home, but now on richer earth and on a larger scale, for a man who had been landless was suddenly a man of substance. He built himself a hall, or took over one already standing, the long timber house of the north that was home and farmstead and seat of his small authority, all in one, the fire down its centre, the benches along its sides, the household gathered under its roof. He stocked his ground with beasts, the cattle and the sheep and the swine, and he set the plough to the fields, breaking the rich soil for the grain that would feed his household through the turning year. And the seasons took him, as they take every man who lives by the land, into their slow round, the ploughing and the sowing of the spring, the tending and the haymaking of the summer, the harvest of the autumn, the slaughter and the mending and the waiting of the winter, year upon year, the deep old rhythm of the farming life, replacing the sharp broken rhythm of the war. The hands that had gripped the spear gripped the plough handles. The man who had watched for the gathering of the enemy now watched the weather and the growing grain. The sea chest that had held his gear for the crossing sat now in the corner of his hall, and the sword above the door was for show and for need, but the daily work was the work of the soil. It was a quieter life and a settled one, and after the years of the sea and the war there must have been, for many a man, a deep contentment in it, the contentment of a goal long sought and finally won. A home of one's own on good ground in a fair country, a thing to keep and to leave to one's sons. There must have been wonder in it too. That first year of working a ground so different from the one he was born to. The soil here was deeper and richer than the thin earth of home, turning dark and fat behind the plough, holding the seed and giving back the grain in a measure the old country had never matched. The seasons came milder, the winters shorter and less cruel, the growing time longer, so that a man used to wringing a bare living from a hard land found himself, here with a holding that fed his household and left a surplus over, a thing he had perhaps never known in his life. The very weeds and beasts and birds were a little strange to him at first. The look of the woods, the run of the streams, the lie of the weather. And he learned them season by season, as a man learns a new country, until the strangeness wore off and the new ground became simply home, known in his bones as the old country had once been. And there was the labour of making the holding his own, which filled those early years, for a farm is never finished, but always in the making. There were fields to clear and drain and bring into good heart, fences and banks to raise, the byre and the barn and the outbuildings to set up about the hall. There were beasts to breed up into a herd, and seed corn to save and sow, and the slow, patient building of a steading out of the granted land. Year by year, until what had been merely a portion marked off after a conquest became a true farm, settled and stocked and worked, with the marks of his own hands on every part of it. It was the work his people had always done, the old work of wresting a living from the earth, but done now on better ground and on his own account, a free man on his own land. And there is no kind of work that more deeply makes a place a man's home than the working of its soil through the turning year. So the warrior sank his roots into the conquered ground, year upon year, the foreign country becoming, by the labour of his hands and the turning of the years, his own. The land that he had once ridden across as a raider, taking what he wanted and moving on, he now walked as its owner, knowing every field and fence and furrow of his portion of it, bound to it by the deep patient bonds of toil and dwelling and time. The raider had become a farmer, and the farmer had become a man of this country. His old roving life is far behind him now, as the home shore that had sunk beneath the sea on the morning he set out. And on that settled ground he raised in time the thing that would outlast him, a household and a family, in a way we should look at now. For it is the gentlest turn in the whole hard tale. For he did not live alone on his new soil, and here is where the story turns gentlest of all. For the settlers, being mostly men, took wives from among the people of the country they had conquered. The host had crossed the sea as an army of men, and an army of men cannot make a people, and so the settlers married English women, the daughters of the very country they had taken, and made households that were half of one people and half of the other, mixed homes where two tongues and two ways met at one hearth. It is a strange and a moving thing to consider that the conquest which began in such violence should end in so many homes, in marriage and children and the ordinary love of a household. The conqueror and the conquered joined in the most intimate of all bonds, raising together the children who would be of both peoples and neither. And the marrying was only one part of a deeper change, the slow turning of an army into a people, that ran through the whole later life of the host. For a force that crosses the sea to raid is one thing, a band of fighting men who mean to return home, but a force that crosses the sea to stay becomes over the years something quite different, a migration, a movement of a whole people setting up a new life in a new land. Women came into the host's world, not only the English wives taken in the settled country, but, as the years passed and the settlement took hold, women of the newcomers' own people too, crossing the sea in their turn to join the men who had won land, so that the camps and the new steadings came to hold not only warriors, but households, wives and mothers and daughters, children born in the new country who had never seen the old. We know this is so, again because the ground remembers it. For among the graves dug up from the host's camps and settlements are the graves of women and even of children, laid in the earth with the gear and the ornaments of their own people, the certain sign that this was no army of men alone, but a society on the move, carrying its families and its whole way of life across the sea to plant in conquered soil. The host had come as an army. It stayed as a people. And that is perhaps the deepest truth of the entire venture, that what landed on the beach as a war band of raiders became, within a generation, a settled folk of farmers and traders and craftsmen and their wives and children, living, working, marrying, dying, and being buried in the ground they had taken, as much at home in it now as the people they had conquered. It changes the whole shape of the story to see it so. Not as a raid that happened to last, but as a migration that happened to begin in war. These were people seeking a new home, and they found it, and they made it, and they filled it with their families and their dead, until the land that had been a foreign shore to be plundered became the homeland of their children and their children's children, who knew no other. The sword had opened the door, but it was the plough and the marriage bed and the cradle and the grave that truly took the country, the slow, deep work of a people putting down roots. And it is that, far more than any battle, that made the venture last. And those children were the true end of the venture, for they grew up in a world that was already a blending of the two peoples, speaking a tongue that mixed the words of both, heirs to the land their fathers had taken, and to the blood of the people their fathers had taken it from. Within a generation or two, the sharp line between the newcomers and the native folk began to blur and fade. the two peoples mixing and merging on the ground they now shared, until it grew hard to say where the one ended and the other began. The settlers took up the ways of the country as the country took up theirs. They turned in time from the old gods to the new faith. For a heathen settled among Christians, married to a Christian wife, raising children in a Christian kingdom, came in the end to the Christian God. And within a few generations, the descendants of the heathen host were Christian themselves. Their old gods faded to half-remembered names. The turning of the host to the new faith is one of the quietest and most far-reaching changes of all, and it is worth dwelling on, for it shows how a conquest becomes a settlement and a foe becomes a neighbour. It did not happen all at once, nor only through marriage and the gradual seep of the years. There came a moment, famous in the chronicles, when the leader of one great part of the host, after long war against the stubborn southern king, was beaten at last in a great battle, and made peace, and as a term of that peace agreed to take up the new faith himself, to be baptized into the God of the people he had fought so long. And so this heathen war leader, who had spent years harrying a Christian land, stood and was baptized, the southern king himself standing sponsor to him, the two enemies bound now by the bond of that right. And the heathen lord took a Christian name and led his men away to settle the land that had been granted him, and kept the peace thereafter. Think what that meant beyond the politics of it. A man who had crossed the sea to take a country by the sword, who had worshipped the old gods of war and fate, who had burned the houses of the southern god and stripped them of their treasure, now bowed his head to that very God and took his water and his name. Some did it, no doubt, as a mere term of peace, a price paid to keep the land they had won, with the old gods still warm in their hearts. But for many, over the years that followed, the new faith struck root in earnest, as it took root in their wives and their children, until the grandsons of the men who had plundered the monasteries were themselves giving land and gold to build churches, founding the very kind of house their grandfathers had burned. The wheel came full round, the heathen become Christian, the destroyers become builders, and the deep gulf between the two peoples, the gulf of the gods that had made the conquest seem a war of one world against another, was closed at last. Not by the sword, but by the slow, patient work of the years and the faith and the blood. The venture that had come to take the country ended by joining it. The takers absorbed into the taken, the two streams running together into one. There is a deep lesson in that, and a hopeful one, threaded through all the violence of the tale. The conquest was real and brutal, and the suffering it caused was real. But what it became, in the end, was not the erasure of one people by another, but the mingling of two into something new. The hard-fought ground settling at last into homes and farms and families, where the children of the conquerors and the conquered grew up together as one folk. The sword gave way to the plough, the raid to the marriage, the war to the slow, patient work of living together on shared ground, and the country was not destroyed, but changed, enriched, made into something it had not been before, and could not have been without the coming of the host. Let us follow that mingling to one of its brightest fruits, the great town that the settlers raised in the north, before we turn to the marks the whole venture left upon the land for all the ages after. The brightest fruit of the settlement rose in the north. At the old city the English had called Eoforwick, and the newcomers renamed in their own tongue Jorvik, the town we now call York. It had been a city already, an old Roman foundation and an English royal and holy seat, but under the rule of the Norse kings who now held the north, it became something more, one of the richest and busiest trading towns in all the northern world. A place to rival the great markets the settlers had known at home. For these people were traders as deeply as they were warriors. And once the conquest had settled into rule, the old genius for commerce reasserted itself. And Jorvik boomed. The wealth of the conquered country and the reach of the northern trade roads met in it, and it swelled into a crowded, thriving, cosmopolitan town of many thousands, its streets packed with workshops and its wharves with ships. We know this town well, for the wet ground of York has kept its remains as few other places have, and those who have dug into it have brought its streets back to life in extraordinary detail. The timber houses and the plankways, the workshops of the leather workers and the metalsmiths and the makers of combs and beads and cloth, the debris of a busy trading life. They have found the goods that passed through it, carried from far away, silk from the distant east, amber from the northern shores, wine and pottery from the south, the coins of many lands, the marks of a town tied by trade to half the known world. They have found the ordinary stuff of daily living, the shoes and the bowls and the tools and the toys, the bones of the meals eaten, the seeds and the pollen that tell of what the townsfolk grew and ate, the settled warriors and their descendants had built on the ground they conquered, not a ruin, but a flourishing town, a centre of craft and trade and wealth, a living proof that the venture had ended not in destruction, but in a new and prosperous order, taking root in the conquered soil. Walk its streets a moment, in your mind. This town the settlers raised, for it was a place teeming with life. The ways between the houses were laid with timber and brushwood against the mud, and they were narrow and crowded, lined close with the workshops and dwellings of the townsfolk, each plot packed tight against its neighbours. From the open fronts of the workshops came the sounds and smells of 100 crafts at once. The ring of the smith's hammer, the rasp of the comb maker, working antler and bone, the reek of the tanner's pits and the dyer's vats, the smoke of the metal worker's fire, the whole busy din of a town that made things and sold them. There were traders crying their wares and beasts driven through to slaughter, and the river crowded with boats bringing goods up from the sea and carrying others away. The wharves piled with barrels and bales and the stuff of a far-reaching trade. The streets were thick with people of every kind, the descendants of the settlers and of the native English now grown together, traders from distant lands speaking strange tongues, the rich and the poor and the free and the unfree. All the crowded human swarm of a great trading town. It was, in its noise and its stench and its crowded, bustling life, a world away from the cold, lonely sea the settlers' fathers had crossed, and a world away, too, from the thin, scattered farms of the homeland, and that was the measure of how far the venture had come. The men who had landed on a beach with their swords had founded, within a few generations, one of the richest towns in the north, a place of craft and commerce and plenty, where their grandchildren lived, lives their warrior forefathers could scarcely have imagined. Lives of trade and making and settled urban prosperity. The sword had won the ground, the plough had rooted them in it. And here, in the crowded streets of the trading town, was the third and final fruit of it all, the wealth and the life and the civilization that grew up on the conquered soil, the deepest proof that these men had come, not merely to destroy, but in the end, to build, and the rule the settlers set up over the lands they held came to be known, in time, by a name that has stuck to it ever since, the Danelaw, the part of England that lived under Danish law and Danish custom rather than English. For wherever the host had settled in strength, in the north and the east and the Midlands, it brought its own ways with it, its own law, its own measures and customs and manner of holding land. And these took root in the conquered ground and shaped the life of those regions for generations. The very name says it, the Danelaw, the law of the Danes, marking out a whole swathe of the country as a land living under the customs the settlers had carried across the sea. It was a real and a lasting division. The Danelaw and the English lands beyond it, and though the two would in time be drawn back together into a single kingdom, the mark of that division, the deep imprint of the Danish settlement, never wholly faded from the north and the east of the country. For the truth is that the settlement changed the land forever, and changed it most deeply not in its kings or its battles which pass, but in the very ground and the very speech of the people, which endure. Look at the map of England today, in the north and the east, where the host settled thickest, and you may read the settlement still, written in the names of the places, for the settlers named their new homes in their own tongue, and the names have lasted more than 1,000 years. Every town and village whose name ends in a certain northern way is a settler's mark upon the land, a place named by the newcomers, and they are scattered in their hundreds across the whole region the host took. Each one a small monument to a settler who put down roots there and gave his new home a name in the language of the people across the sea. To know how to read those names is to see the settlement laid out over the country like a stain that the centuries have not washed out. The deep print of the men who came out of the sea and stayed. And deeper even than the names of the places is the mark the settlers left on the very language of the country. For when two peoples live side by side and marry and mingle as these did, their tongues mingle too. And the speech of the conquered country took into itself a great host of words from the speech of the settlers. Words so common now that no one thinks of them as foreign at all. The everyday words of the home and the body and the world, words used 100 times a day by people who have never heard of the host that brought them, came into the language from the tongue of the settlers and have lived in it ever since. Even some of the smallest and most essential words of all, the very words a speaker uses to point to other people, came in from the settler's speech and drove out the older native words, sinking so deep into the language that they became its unremarked bones. The men who crossed the sea left their mark, not only on the map and in the blood of the people, but in the mouths of every speaker of the tongue forever after, an inheritance carried unknowing by millions who could not name its source. There is something almost staggering in that, the reach of it across the centuries, that a venture begun by a few thousand men on a beach more than 1,000 years ago should still be living, this very day, in the names on the signposts and the words in the mouths of a whole people. And deeper than the names and the words, deeper than anything written or spoken, the venture lives on in the very blood of the people of the land, for the settlers did not vanish. They merged, and their descendants are there still, mingled past all separating, into the people of the country they came to take. In the generations after the settlement, the two streams that had met, the newcomers and the native English, ran together and became one. The sharp division of the Danelaw softening, the kingdoms drawn back at last into a single realm. The descendants of the host and the descendants of those they conquered living together, marrying together until there was no telling them apart and no point in trying. The conquerors were not a layer laid over the conquered, as in some conquests. A ruling few above a subject many, kept separate by law and blood. They were absorbed, taken in, dissolved into the general people of the land, their blood spread so wide and so thin through the population that it became simply part of the common inheritance of the country, carried now by countless people who have not the faintest notion that a sea rover of the north is among their forefathers. It is a quiet kind of immortality and a fitting end to the tale, that the men who came to take a country should end not as its masters, but as its ancestors, woven into the very people of the land. Their blood and their words and their place names become the unnoticed bones of a nation that no longer remembers where they came from. The terror passed. The kingdoms that were broken were rebuilt. The wounds of the conquest healed, as the wounds of conquest do, over the unhurried centuries, until what was left was not a scar, but a strengthening, the rich addition of one people to another. The country made larger and deeper and more various for the coming of the men out of the sea. They did not destroy the land, In the end, they joined it and became it and live in it still, in the names and the words and the blood. More truly and more lastingly than any conqueror who merely ruled and passed away. Let us hold that reach a moment, and then turn to the human heart of it all, before we lie down at last to sleep. And the men who did it all grew old, in time, as men do, on the land they had won, and that is a thing worth pausing on before we draw out the meaning of it. The boy who had leaned green and frightened on his oar in the cold dawn of the crossing became, if he lived, a grey-bearded man sitting by his own fire in his own hall in the conquered country, his fighting days behind him. His land worked now by his grown sons, his grandchildren playing about his feet. And to those children, gathered at the fire on a winter's night, he would tell it, the whole of it, the great venture of his youth, the gathering of the host and the crossing of the sea, the storm and the landing and the war, the building of the camps and the winning of the land, the days when he and his swordfellows had been young and the world had lain open before them. The children would listen, wide-eyed, to the old man's tales of a time before they were born, of a home country across the sea they had never seen and would never see, of gods half abandoned and battles long over and a sea crossing that had become, in the telling, a thing of wonder and legend. And so the venture passed, even in the lifetime of the men who had made it, out of the world of deeds and into the world of story, becoming the tale told by the old to the young, the founding legend of the families and the settlements, the answer to the children's question of how they came to be here, in this realm, this people. The grey old men died, one by one, the last of those who remembered the home country and the crossing and the war, and were buried in the ground they had taken. And with them died the living memory of it, leaving only the stories, handed down and changed and dimmed, and the names on the land, and the words in the speech, and the blood in the people. The deeds became legend. The legend faded into half-remembered tales. And the tales, in their turn, faded toward forgetting, until almost nothing was left but what the ground itself remembered, and what the patient labour of later ages could dig up and piece together, to give us, at last, the dim outline of who these people were and what they did. That is what we have been doing tonight, you and I, gathering up those dim and scattered remnants and breathing a single life back into them, so that we might feel, for one evening, what the old man by the fire remembered, and it brings us, at the last, to the human heart of it all. Let me draw out, before we rest, the human heart of this whole story, for it is easy, in the telling of conquests and kingdoms, to lose the people in the pattern, and these were, first and last, people. Strip away the drama of the heathen host and the broken kingdoms, and what you find at the bottom of it is something old and human and almost familiar. A movement of people from a place that could not hold them, to a place that could, in search of the thing people have always crossed the world to find, which is a better life. The men who came out of the sea were conquerors, yes, and raiders, and they did real and terrible harm to the people they fell upon, and that must never be softened or denied. But they were also migrants, in the deepest sense. Men leaving a crowded and a stingy homeland for a richer one, seeking land and a living and a future that their own country could not give them. Exactly as people have done in every age and every corner of the earth. Think of the younger son again, the man with no land at home, no inheritance, no prospect of ever being more than a hand on his elder brother's farm. The venture across the sea was, for him, the one door open, the one chance to become a man of substance, to win ground of his own and a name and a place in the world. He took it, with all its danger and all its violence, because the alternative was a life of nothing, and he was not a monster for taking it, only a man playing the hard hand his world had dealt him, as men have always done. And what he was reaching for, beneath the silver and the conquest, was the same thing his descendants and ours reach for, still a home, a piece of ground, a family, a future for his children better than his own past. The venture began in violence and ended in farms and marriages and children. And that arc, from the sword to the plough, from the raid to the home, is one of the most human arcs there is. The wild young man's hunger settling, in the end, into the deep old wish to belong somewhere and to build something that lasts. That is the thing to hold as we lie down at last. The humanity beneath the history. Not to excuse the harm, for the harm was real, but to understand the people, who were neither the demons the frightened monks saw, nor the heroes of any simple tale, but human beings, brave and cruel and hopeful and afraid, doing the hard and dangerous and sometimes terrible work of seeking a better life across a wide and frightening sea. They are not so far from us as the 1,000 years would make them seem. The young man at the oar, leaving everything for an unknown shore, hoping for a life he could not have at home, is a figure you would know if you met him. A figure walking the roads and crossing the seas of the world this very night, and the recognition of him, across all the centuries, is perhaps the truest thing this story has to give. Let us carry that recognition with us now, as we leave the long history behind and come back, for the last of the night, to the single life we have been living through it, and lie down to sleep in the conquered realm. For you have lived a lifetime in this one telling, and it is right before sleep to come back into it one last time and feel where it has brought you. Let the years fall away, and the kingdoms and the campaigns, and find yourself once more a single man, no longer young, standing at the edge of your own field in the evening light of the country you crossed the sea to reach. The country that is now, past all expectation, your home. The light is low and golden over the English fields, the same low gold that falls on the fields of your far-off birth country, but warmer here, kinder, lying over a richer and a gentler land. Your day's work is done. The plough stands at the field's edge. The cattle are turning toward the byre, and you stand a moment at the boundary of your own ground, looking out over it, the soil you have broken and sown and reaped, the acres that are yours and your children's after you, one out of a country that did not know you were coming on the morning you set out across the sea. Feel what it is to be him, in that moment, the warrior turned farmer. The landless boy turned man of substance, standing on ground of his own in the evening of a life that has carried him further than he ever dreamed. Behind him is the sea and the crossing and the cold and the fear and the war, all of it done now, all of it survived. Around him is the new country, grown familiar over the years, the fields and the woods and the river, the village down the track, the hall behind him with its fire and its household. Within the hall is his wife, of the people of this country, and his children, who are of both peoples and at home in this land as he could never quite be, who speak its tongue as their own and will live and die in it and pass it to their children. And in him is a deep and settled peace, the peace of a goal long sought and finally won, the peace of a man who set out with nothing and has come through all the hardness of the world. To a home, it was for this in the end that he crossed the sea, not for the silver, though the silver was sweet, not for the glory, though the glory was real, but for this quiet evening at the edge of his own field, for the ground beneath his feet that is his, for the household at his back and the children who will outlast him, for a home and a place in the world that his birth had denied him, and that he reached out and took with his own 2 hands across 1,000 miles of cold water. The venture that the chronicles remember as terror and ruin was, for the man who lived it through to its end, the long, hard road, to exactly this, a quiet field in the evening, a home at last. Hold that with him, the deep peace of the journey's end, as the light goes golden and then grey over the English fields, and let us turn back toward the hall and the fire and our rest. For the day is over, and it is time, at the very last, to sleep. So turn now, with the last of the evening light, and walk back across your own field toward the hall, the day's work behind you. Your feet sure on the ground, that is yours. The smoke of your own fire rising ahead to meet you. The air is cooling as the light fails, the way it always does, and there is the smell of the evening meal on it, and the lowing of the cattle settling in the byre, and the small sounds of a household drawing in for the night. And all of it is yours, all of it home. Step in through the door of the hall, out of the falling dusk, into the fire-lit warmth within, and let the day end around you, for there is nothing more it asks of you now. The hall is dim and warm, the fire burning steady down its centre, the gleam of it moving soft on the timber walls and the faces of your household. There is food, the plain good food of your own land worked by your own hands. The bread and the meat and the ale. And there is the quiet talk of the evening, and the children and your wife of this country moving in the firelight, and the deep ordinary peace of a household at the end of a day. The benches run down the sides of the hall, spread with skins and woolens, and as the evening wears on and the fire sinks and the talk dies away, the household settles to its rest, each finding a place to lie. The way your people have always slept, gathered together in the one warm room, with the fire banked low and the door barred against the night. Find your own place among them then, and lie down, and let the long day, and the long life, and the long history of it all settle to rest with you. You are warm, you are home. The fire glows low and steady, its heat reaching you where you lie, the dark of the new land night held off beyond the timber walls. The household breathing all around you in the dim. There is nothing left to do. The field is ploughed, and the work is done, and the meal is eaten, and the door is barred. And there is nothing now between you and sleep but the simple letting go, the laying down of the day. Let your body settle into the bedding then, and begin to let it go. Feel the weight of you sink down at last, the whole frame of you growing heavy and easy, released from the holding of the day. Feel the soles of your feet that walk the field all day come to rest. The work gone out of them, nothing more for them to carry. Feel your legs grow heavy and loose along the bedding, sinking. Sense the broad muscles of your back and your shoulders, that bent to the plough and once to the oar. Ease and soften, and let go their day-long holding. Let your arms grow slack, your hands open and still, the day's work finished in them. And let the held places of your face, the brow and the jaw and the eyes, soften and smooth and rest until there is no holding left anywhere in you. Only the warm, heavy ease of a body wholly at ease. Let your breathing slow and deepen, falling into the slow, easy rhythm of sleep. The rhythm the household breathes all around you in the dim hall. There is no need to do anything but breathe, the breath coming and going of itself, slow and full and unforced, each one carrying you a little further down. With every breath out, let a little more of the day go. With every breath out, sink a little deeper into the warm dark, a touch nearer to sleep. The fire settles, the household breathes, the night holds steady beyond the walls, and you go down, gently, breath by breath, into the deep good rest of a man at home on his own ground at the end of a long road. And as you lie there sinking, let the whole of the long journey settle behind you, all of it done now, all of it brought safe to this quiet end. The cold beach in the dawn and the gathering of the host, the ships drawn up on the shingle and the loading of the gear, the home shore falling away astern until it slipped beneath the sea and was gone. The days of open water, the wet and the cold and the endless heaving, the backs bent to the oars, the longing for land, the wild night of the storm, and the bailing, and the fear, and the morning after when the ship still swam, the cry from the bow, and the low dark line of the foreign coast lifting out of the haze, the keel grinding onto the sand, and the first stagger of your feet on solid ground. All of it behind you now. Survived, finished, laid down at last, like a heavy pack at the end of the road. And the years that followed, the war and the camps and the conquest, the riding out and the hard fighting and the silver shared at the fires, the breaking of the kingdoms and the winning of the land. The plough set at last to your own ground, the hall raised, the wife taken. The children born who are of this country and your own both. The long unhurried turning of the seasons over your own fields, year upon year, until the venture that began in a cold dawn on a far beach had become this, a settled life, a home, a name, a place in the world. All of it behind you now, all of it brought to its rest, the whole of a life carried from the one shore to the other and set down complete, in the warm, dim hall on the ground you made your own. There is nothing left to reach for now, nothing left to win, nowhere left to go. You set out across the sea with empty hands and a young man's hunger, and you have come, through all of it, to a place of your own and a household around you, and the deep peace of a journey ended. The hunger is fed, the crossing is made, the land is won, and ploughed, and home. And there is nothing more for you to do tonight, or ever again, but to lie here in the warmth and let it all go and rest. The way a man rests who has done his work and reached his place and has no more roads to walk. Let the sounds of the night settle over you, the small sounds of the resting hall, the breathing of your household near you, the soft shift and settle of the banked fire, the wind moving low over the thatch outside, the deep quiet of a country asleep. Let your thoughts, if any are still stirring, grow slow and dim and far, drifting loose from you like smoke rising from the embers, thinning, fading, gone. There is no grip to keep, no thought to follow, no task before you at all. Let the quiet come in and fill the places the thoughts leave empty, the soft deep hush of the sleeping hall, the hush of the sleeping land, settling over you and through you until all that remains in you is warmth and weight and the gentle rise and fall of your own easy breath. Let the warm hall hold you. Let the household sleep around you. Let the banked fire keep its low, steady heat through the dark hours, and the barred door keep the night out, and the new country, grown dear over all the years, hold you safe on the ground you made your home. You are where you set out to be. You are home, and warm, and at rest, with the long journey behind you and the whole night ahead for sleeping. There is nowhere you need to be but here, and nothing you need to do but this, to lie still in the warmth and let yourself go down, gently, with no edge and no end, into the deep good sleep at the end of the long road. Sink the last of the way now, slow and easy, the way the tide goes out, drawing back from the shore a little further, with every breath, carrying you down and out into the deep still water of sleep. The hall fades softly around you. The fire fades to a far warm glow. The breathing of the household and the wind in the thatch and the hush of the sleeping land all blur and soften and run together into one low gentle murmur at the edge of hearing, and then, below even that, into silence, into rest, into the sound and dreamless calm of a man come home at last across the sea. Let go. You are there. You have arrived. And nothing remains now but to drift. Before you go all the way down, let me say one last quiet thing, and then I will leave you to your rest. The men we have crossed the sea with tonight were real. And the country they came to was real. and the life we have lived through together is woven from the true things they left behind. The camps and the graves and the names on the land and the words still in our mouths. Reconstructed with care into a single life that you might feel, for one evening, what it was to be one of them. If these journeys into other times are something you would like to find again on other nights, when sleep is slow to come, you are welcome to follow along, so that more of them can make their way to you. There is nothing to do now but rest. That is all, and it is enough. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.